The dog had mauled 6 handlers in 11 months, broken a colonel's wrist, sent a decorated K9 trainer to surgery. The base veterinarian had already drawn up the euthanasia paperwork, twice. Now the animal paced his kennel like something caged at the end of the world, and every soldier on the base agreed the only humane option left was a needle and a body bag. Then a quiet ER nurse in blue scrubs stopped outside the chain-link fence, tilted her head, and said nothing for a long moment. The dog froze, and nobody in that yard could explain what happened next. Before this story goes any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now. Every week I bring you stories like this one, the kind that don't make the evening news but absolutely should. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The morning started the way most mornings did at Keller Pines Military Medical Center, with somebody already running late and the coffee machine on the second floor completely out of service. Nora Voss clocked in at 6:48 a.m., 12 minutes before her shift officially began, and spent those 12 minutes reading the board in the ER break room. She had a habit of coming in early, not because anyone asked her to, but because she preferred to know what she was walking into. 2 overnight admissions, 1 surgical consult pending, a note from the charge nurse about the supply room being locked again because someone had walked off with the only key card. Nora drank her coffee black and didn't say much to the 3 nurses already gathered around the table. She wasn't unfriendly. They would have told you that if you asked. She was just quiet in the way that some people are quiet, the way that made newer staff occasionally wonder if they'd done something wrong, until they worked with her long enough to realize she simply didn't talk unless she had something worth saying. She was 33 years old, medium height, with dark circles under her eyes that had been there so long nobody thought to comment on them anymore. She'd been at Keller Pines for 14 months, transferred from a civilian trauma center in Braddock Falls, Montana, no explanation given, no drama attached to it. She kept her personal life off the floor. She was precise with medications, calm in emergencies, and never once raised her voice at a patient even when the patient deserved it. Most of the staff liked her fine. A few found her a little unsettling without being able to say exactly why. The hospital sat on the eastern edge of Fort Calloway, a mid-sized installation in the high desert of southeastern New Mexico, close enough to the mountains that on clear mornings you could see snow on the peaks and still be sweating by noon. Keller Pines served both the base population and surrounding civilian communities, which meant the ER was a strange and constant mix: children with ear infections, soldiers with training injuries, occasional trauma from the highway. It was not a glamorous posting. Staff turned over regularly. Nora had stayed longer than most. She was finishing her coffee when Liz Dabrowski, one of the day shift nurses who had worked at Keller Pines for 11 years, and treated newcomers with the careful skepticism of someone who had watched too many of them leave, walked in and dropped a stack of charts on the table with more force than necessary. "Did you hear about the K9 situation?" Nora looked up. "Which one?" "The shepherd, Rex, over in the working dog compound." Liz poured herself coffee without looking at anyone. "They're putting him down today." "Today? Paperwork's already signed. Dr. Ferris is doing it at 1300. She said it flatly, the way you say things when you've already processed them and moved on. 6 handlers in less than a year. Broke Captain Mercer's wrist so bad he needed 2 surgeries. They've been trying to rehabilitate him for months, and he just keeps getting worse. Nora set her mug down. "What happened to his original handler?" Liz finally looked at her. "Killed. 8 months ago, Afghanistan." There was a short silence. "That's the part that gets you," said one of the other nurses, a younger woman named Tanya Osei, who had a habit of saying out loud the things other people kept to themselves. Like, he lost his person, and nobody ever really dealt with that part. "He attacked 6 people," Liz said. "They dealt with it plenty." Nora said nothing. She picked up her mug, finished the last of her coffee, and walked out to start her shift. The morning moved fast, the way mornings at Keller Pines tended to. A construction worker with a laceration that needed 7 stitches, a soldier with a suspected stress fracture in his foot, 2 pediatric cases that turned out to be nothing serious, and one that turned out to be more serious than anyone initially thought. Nora moved through all of it at the same measured pace, unhurried in a way that wasn't slowness but something else. the kind of physical calm that comes from spending years in situations where panic was not an option. She was finishing up a chart at the nursing station around 10:15 when she heard raised voices from the direction of the main corridor. Not patient voices, staff voices. She turned the corner and found a small cluster of people. 2 nurses, an orderly, and Dr. Preston Hale, the ER attending physician, who was tall and broad-shouldered and spoke with the mild impatience of someone who had been mildly impatient for so long it had become his default register, all of them looking out the large window that faced the eastern walkway. Through the glass, Nora could see the K9 compound's perimeter fence about 80 yards away. A handful of soldiers and what looked like a base veterinarian in a gray jacket stood outside the kennel area. There was a transport crate near the gate. "They're moving him for the procedure," the orderly said. "Guy I know in security said the dog went absolutely berserk this morning, threw himself against the kennel door hard enough to crack the frame." "Wouldn't you?" Tanya had appeared from somewhere, arms crossed, watching. "Tanya," Dr. Hale said, not looking at her, "I'm just saying." Nora was already moving toward the side exit. She wasn't sure what she intended to do. She told herself later that she hadn't intended anything specific. She'd been close to her break anyway. She was outside. She walked in that direction the way you sometimes walk toward something without consciously deciding to. That was what she told herself. The heat outside was immediate and dry. She crossed the pavement toward the perimeter, and by the time she was close enough to see clearly, the scene resolved itself into something that made her slow down. The shepherd was at the far end of his kennel run, pressed against the chain link in a way that wasn't aggression. His ears were flat, his head was low. His body language was all wrong for an attacking dog. It was the posture of something that had been cornered so many times it had stopped expecting anything except the next corner. Nora stood at the outer fence and looked at him for a long moment. "Hey!" One of the soldiers, young, maybe 22, with the careful authority of someone who'd been given a specific task and was executing it correctly, stepped toward her. "Ma'am, you need to stay back. This animal is dangerous and we're in the middle of a procedure preparation." "I'm not in the kennel," Nora said. "You're too close to the perimeter. Please step back." "What was his handler's name?" The soldier blinked. "Excuse me?" "His original handler, the one who was killed." A pause. Something shifted in the young soldier's face, not quite discomfort, but close to it. "Master Sergeant Dylan Marsh, ma'am, I really need you to—" The dog had turned. He wasn't looking at the soldiers or the veterinarian or the transport crate. He was looking at Nora. His ears had moved, not forward in aggression, but at an angle that was something else entirely. He took one step toward the inner fence and stopped. "He's about to—" someone said. Nora raised one hand, palm out, without looking away from the dog. "He's not about to do anything." "Lady, that animal put Captain Mercer in surgery." "I know." She still didn't look away from the dog. "What word did Marsh use?" "During training." "His command word." Silence behind her. Then the base veterinarian, a compact woman in her 40s named Dr. Suri Almeida, who had been watching with the expression of someone cataloging an unexpected variable, said slowly, "How do you know handlers use individual command words?" "Does it matter right now?" Nora said. "We're not giving you classified training information," the young soldier said. He sounded slightly less certain than he had 30 seconds ago. "I'm not asking for classified information. I'm asking what word Marsh used to tell this dog he was safe." No one answered. The transport crate sat in the dust near the gate, its door hanging open. Nora looked at the dog for another moment. Then she said quietly, not loudly, not dramatically, just the way you'd say something you were fairly sure was true. "Anchor." The shepherd went still. Not frozen, not tense. Still in the way that animals go still when something cuts through the noise. When a sound or a word or a scent hits something deeply stored and the whole nervous system pauses to confirm it. His tail dropped, not in submission, in something closer to exhaustion, and then he lay down, flat on the ground, head between his paws, and he made a sound, low, not a growl, not a bark, something that didn't have a clean human equivalent, something that made the young soldier take a half step back and say nothing at all. Dr. Almeida was the first one to break the silence, and she did it by pulling out her radio and speaking into it in the clipped, specific way that meant whatever she was saying wasn't optional. Nora turned around. 3 soldiers, The veterinarian and a facilities worker were all looking at her with variations of the same expression. The particular look people get when something has happened that they know they're going to have to account for, and aren't yet sure how. That was a guess, the young soldier said. He sounded like he was trying to convince himself. Was it? Nora asked. How did you know that word? She didn't answer that. She looked back at the dog, who had not moved. His eyes were still on her, and there was something in them that she recognized. Not because she'd spent years around military working dogs, though she had. Not because she'd worked alongside handlers who talked about their animals the way other soldiers talked about their unit. But because grief looked the same across species. It was tired in a specific way. It had no more anger left in it. It was just waiting. Give me 2 weeks, she said. Excuse me, Dr. Almeida said. 2 weeks before the euthanasia order is carried out. Let me work with him. The veterinarian stared at her. You're a nurse. I know what I am. You have no training in... I have more training in trauma response than you're currently aware of. Nora said it without heat, without apology, in the same flat factual register she used when correcting a medication dosage. 2 weeks. That's all I'm asking. You're not asking the right people. Dr. Almeida crossed her arms. The order was signed by Colonel Yates. I don't have the authority to suspend it. Then who does? A pause. You'd need to go through the K9 program commander, Major Callum Streck. Almeida said it in a way that made clear she thought this was a waste of both their times. Where's his office? Major Callum Streck was a heavy-set man in his early 50s with the kind of face that had probably been expressive once and had gradually stopped bothering. He had run the K9 program at Fort Calloway for 6 years, which meant he had dealt with every variation of an animal welfare crisis that could occur in a military setting, and he had the paperwork to prove it. He listened to Nora for approximately 90 seconds before he interrupted her. You're the ER nurse? Yes. From the hospital? Yes. And you want me to postpone a signed euthanasia order for a military working dog that has injured 6 personnel, including a captain who will be in physical therapy for the next 4 months, based on, he glanced at his notepad, a word. Based on a documented trauma response that's being misread as aggression, Nora said, and yes, partly on the word, which tells us what we need to know about where his breakdown started. He's a military asset, Ms. Voss, not a patient. With respect, Major, the way he's been handled since Marcia's death has made him more dangerous, not less. You've been trying to correct behavior that isn't behavioral. It's grief. And nobody in this program has been treating it as such. Streck put down his pen. You're here because you're going to tell me you know something about military working dogs. I'm here because I watched an animal who's been written off respond in 4 seconds to a word nobody on this base remembered to try. How did you know that word? There it was again, that question. Nora looked at him steadily. Because I spent 7 years working alongside units that use dogs like Rex, and I learned to pay attention. 7 years doing what exactly? She didn't answer immediately. Something moved across her face. Not evasion, not embarrassment. Something more deliberate than either of those things. I was a combat medic. Special operations attachment. My record is classified. Streck's expression didn't change, but his attention did. The way a room changes when someone quietly puts something substantial on the table. That's a significant claim, he said. Yes. And you're working ER nursing at Keller Pines. Yes. I'd need to verify. I know. She stood up. I'm not asking you to take my word for anything. I'm asking for 2 weeks and supervised access. If he doesn't show measurable improvement in the first week, you carry out the order on schedule. Nothing lost. Streck looked at her for a long moment. I'll make some calls, he said finally. Don't go anywhere. He made 3 calls in 40 minutes. Nora sat in the chair outside his office and waited, watching a facilities crew carry equipment across the base courtyard. She wasn't nervous. She'd stopped being nervous about this particular kind of waiting a long time ago. When Streck's door opened again, his face was different. Not warm. That wasn't a word you'd apply to Major Callum Streck at any point in the interaction, but recalibrated. The mild, patronizing edge was gone. You've got 10 days, he said, not 2 weeks. Dr. Almeida will be present for all sessions. You'll sign a liability waiver, you'll wear the appropriate protective gear at all times, and you'll report to me every 48 hours. He paused. Whoever you talked to cleared it for a trial. Thank you, Major. Don't thank me. If that dog puts you in surgery, that's on your paperwork, not mine. Understood. She was almost at the door when he said, Ms. Voss. She stopped. What exactly did you do in special operations? Before you became a nurse? Nora turned around and looked at him. I kept people alive in places where the options were very limited. She walked out. The next morning, Nora arrived at the K9 compound at 6:30 before the day crew came on. Dr. Almeida was already there, standing outside the kennel run with a clipboard and the expression of someone who had agreed to something under professional obligation and was reserving judgment. Rex, the shepherd, was at the back of his run. When Nora approached the fence, he turned and looked at her the same way he had the day before, not with aggression, but with a wariness so entrenched it had the texture of a wall. How do you want to start? Almeida asked. By not starting, Nora said. Not yet. That's not... Give me 10 minutes. She sat down on an overturned equipment crate outside the fence and did nothing. Didn't approach the fence. Didn't speak to the dog. Didn't make eye contact. She just sat. Almeida watched her for 30 seconds and then, reluctantly, sat on the ground beside her. This is unorthodox. I know. We have very limited time. I know that too. 7 minutes passed. Then Rex walked toward the fence. Not quickly. Not in a straight line. He moved the way animals move when they've decided something but want to maintain the option to reverse it. He stopped about 4 feet from the chain link and stood there, watching Nora with those tired eyes. She didn't look at him directly. She looked at a point slightly past him. Hey, she said quietly. Not a command. Just a word. Rex sat down. Behind her, Nora heard Dr. Almeida stop writing on her clipboard. She heard the pen go still. Nora reached into the side pocket of her scrubs and pulled out a piece of dried chicken. She'd picked it up from the base commissary the evening before, unprompted, the way you prepare for something when you already know what it's going to require. She placed it on the ground near the fence line, not reaching through, just leaving it there. Rex looked at it for a long moment. Then he reached his nose through the chain link and took it. Almeida said nothing. She just wrote something on her clipboard, and whatever it was, she underlined it. The third day, Rex let Nora open the gate. Not to come in. She didn't push that. She just stood in the opening, leaning against the frame, not moving forward, not presenting any kind of directional intention. Rex paced the run twice, then came and stood 6 feet in front of her and looked at her face with an intensity that most people would have found unsettling. Nora held his gaze. I know, she said quietly, to no one and to him at the same time. I know. The fourth day was when things started going wrong. Dr. Preston Hale had apparently made a point of asking around about where Nora had been spending her off hours, because he appeared at the K9 compound mid-morning with the expression of a man who had identified a problem and intended to address it efficiently. He stood on the other side of the outer fence and looked at Nora inside the run, with Rex sitting 3 feet away from her, and said, in the tone he used for things that were obviously mismanaged, "This is a liability issue." "I signed the waiver," Nora said. "You're an ER nurse. This is not your department. This is not your area of expertise. And this is not Dr. Hale. An appropriate use of your time when we're running short-staffed on Dr. Hale." She said it again, not loudly, just clearly. He stopped. "I'm on my approved leave hours. I've cleared this through Major Streck. If you have a concern about staffing, you can bring it to charge." A long, cold pause. Hale looked at Rex, then at Nora, then at Dr. Almeida, who was watching with the expression of someone who had decided not to involve herself. "You're making a spectacle of this," Hale said. "I'm sitting in a kennel," Nora replied. He left. Rex watched him go and then, and this was the part Almeida circled 3 times in her notes, turned back to Nora with what could only be described as a deliberate settling. He lay down. He put his head on his paws. He exhaled. Nora exhaled too. "Yeah," she said softly. "Me too." Day 6. And everything fell apart. Nora arrived at 0615 to find the kennel empty. Not empty in the way of a dog being walked or examined. Empty in the finalized way. The crate gone, the water bowl removed, a tag on the gate with a case number written in black marker. She stood at the open kennel door and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the morning temperature. She found Dr. Almeida in the veterinary office, and she didn't wait to be acknowledged. "Where is he?" Almeida looked up from her desk. Her face did something complicated. "There was an incident last night." "What kind of incident?" "One of the night kennel workers, he went in without authorization. Apparently he'd been told by someone on the veterinary team that the dog was safe now." A pause. "Rex bit him. Not severely, but where is Rex?" "Nora." Almeida said her first name for the first time. "Colonel Yates reinstated the euthanasia order this morning. He's moved the timeline up. Dr. Ferris is scheduled for 1100. The clock on the wall behind Almeida read 7:42 a.m. Nora turned and walked out. She was already moving down the corridor when she heard Almeida call after her. "Nora, wait. There's something else. Something we found in the storage lockup when we were clearing Marcia's effects." But Nora was already at the door, and it was swinging shut behind her, and she had exactly 3 hours and 18 minutes, and she was running. The door swung shut behind her, and the morning heat hit her face like a wall, and she was already calculating. 3 hours and 18 minutes. Maybe less if Ferris ran early. Dr. Almeida had said 1100, but military schedules slipped in both directions, and she couldn't count on the later end. She didn't run. Running attracted attention, and attention slowed things down. She walked fast, the kind of fast that looks purposeful instead of desperate, across the main courtyard toward the administrative building on the north side of the base. Her phone was already out. She found the number for Major Streck's office, dialed, and got his assistant on the second ring. "I need to speak with Major Streck, now." "The Major is in a briefing until—" "Tell him it's Nora Voss. Tell him the euthanasia order on the canine Rex has been moved up, and I need 5 minutes before 1100. A pause. "Ma'am, I can't interrupt." "Then put me through to his cell." "I'm not authorized to—" "Write this down." Nora's voice didn't rise. It dropped, which was somehow more effective. "Nora Voss, ER Nursing, Keller Pines. Tell him what I said. He'll decide if it's worth interrupting the briefing." She hung up. She kept walking. The administrative building was 200 yards away, and she used every step of it trying to reconstruct what had actually happened the night before. A kennel worker who'd been told the dog was safe, by someone on the veterinary team. That detail had snagged in her mind the moment Almeida said it, because it was the kind of detail that didn't come from nowhere. Someone had told that worker to go in. Whether out of carelessness or something worse, she didn't know yet, but the fact of it mattered. Rex hadn't bitten anyone unprovoked in 6 days. She'd watched him. She'd sat 3 feet away from him in an open run with no protective gear on day 5, a decision she'd made deliberately and hadn't told Almeida about until after. And he had done nothing except watch her with those exhausted eyes and occasionally lean close enough that she could feel his breath. He wasn't an aggressive dog. He was a traumatized one, and there was a meaningful clinical difference between those two things that nobody in this program seemed willing to actually sit with. Her phone buzzed. Streck. "Tell me what you know," he said, no greeting. She told him in under 90 seconds. The night incident. The unauthorized entry. The fact that someone on the veterinary staff had apparently told the worker it was safe to go in without checking with either Almeida or Nora. Silence on his end. "The order's reinstated," he said. "Yates signed it himself." "I know. I need you to get me 10 minutes with Yates before 1100. "Nora." He said her name the way Almeida had that morning, like he'd shifted registers, and she wasn't sure yet if that was good or bad. "What happened last night undermines everything you demonstrated this week. It undermines a staged situation, not the progress itself. Rex bit someone who entered his space without warning in the middle of the night. That's not regression. That's a normal response to an abnormal intrusion. Yates doesn't see it that way. Then I need to be in the room when he explains how he does see it." Another pause, longer this time. "I can get you 5 minutes, Streck said. "Not 10, and I'm telling you now, Yates is not a patient man and he's already made up his mind. If you go in there with a soft argument, you're wasting both our times." "I don't make soft arguments," Nora said. She heard something that might have been a short exhale of something that wasn't quite amusement. "No," Streck said. "I'm starting to understand that. Colonel Warren Yates was 61 years old, silver-haired, and had the physical bearing of a man who had spent 4 decades making decisions under pressure, and was no longer interested in having those decisions revisited. His office was immaculate in the way that military offices are immaculate, not as a matter of aesthetics, but as an extension of the philosophy that disorder is a choice and choices have consequences. He was standing when Nora came in, which meant he wasn't planning to make this comfortable. Streck was in the corner. He didn't say anything. "You have 5 minutes," Yates said. "I'll use 3. Nora stood in front of his desk without sitting. The incident last night doesn't reflect the dog's actual behavioral trajectory over the past 6 days. It reflects an unauthorized nighttime entry by a worker who was incorrectly informed that the animal was cleared for unsupervised contact. That's an information failure, not a behavioral one." "The result was the same," Yates said. "A member of this base was injured. The result of a process failure on the part of whoever told that worker it was safe to go in. I'd like to know who gave that information because it didn't come from me or from Dr. Almeida." Something shifted in Yates's face, too small and too fast to be certain about. "In 6 days," Nora continued, "Rex went from throwing himself against the kennel door hard enough to crack the frame to sitting 3 feet from me in an open run with no protective barrier. I have documented session notes. Dr. Almeida has corroborating observations. The behavioral pattern is consistent with acute grief response, not irreversible aggression. You're about to euthanize a military working dog with a decorated service record because nobody identified his actual diagnosis. He has injured 6 personnel, under circumstances that would have triggered a stress response in any animal with his history. His handler died in the field. Nobody gave this dog any structured grief intervention. The program put a series of strangers in front of him and told them to take control, and when he reacted to that, everyone called it aggression." She paused. "It wasn't aggression. It was a dog who kept looking for someone who wasn't coming back, and every new handler who showed up and tried to assert authority just confirmed that the person he was looking for was gone." The room was quiet. Yates looked at her for a long moment. His face was not readable in any comfortable way. Then he said, "You have a theory about what happened with Marsh." "I have a clinical observation about what happened to Rex after Marsh died. That's what I can speak to." "And your qualifications for speaking to it?" Nora met his eyes. 7 years attached to special operations as a combat medic. I worked alongside 4 different K9 units across 3 deployments. I know what a traumatized working dog looks like because I spent years watching handlers manage animals in environments where the difference between a dog that could function and one that couldn't was the difference between mission success and casualties. Yates's expression didn't change, but he sat down. That was something. 4 more days, Nora said. Not 10, not 2 weeks. 4 days, and I will bring you documented behavioral evidence sufficient to warrant a full psychological evaluation by an independent K9 specialist. If the evaluation doesn't support rehabilitation, I won't contest the order. She let a beat pass. But if you carry this out at 1100 today, you're going to find out eventually that you executed a decorated war dog for a condition that was treatable. And that's not a conclusion I think you want attached to your program. Yates looked at Streck. Streck, for his part, said nothing. He had the careful neutrality of a man who had done what he said he would do and was now staying precisely out of the way. "Find out who cleared that kennel worker for entry," Yates said finally. "Get me the name by end of day." He looked back at Nora. 4 days, Ms. Voss. Almeida reports directly to me. Any further incidents, we don't have this conversation again. Understood. She walked out. In the corridor, she stopped and let herself breathe for exactly 10 seconds. Then she turned around and walked back toward the veterinary wing, because Almeida had said something as the door was swinging shut, and Nora needed to hear the rest of it. What? Almeida was still at her desk. She looked up when Nora came in, and there was something in her face that Nora hadn't seen there before. Not quite respect, but the preliminary architecture of it. "Yates postponed," Nora said. 4 days. I need to know what you found." Almeida pushed back from her desk and stood. She walked to the far end of the veterinary office, where a narrow storage corridor connected to the records room, and stopped in front of a metal shelving unit. On the second shelf was a cardboard box, the kind that military effects came in. Brown, taped shut, labeled in black marker with a case number and the name Marsh, DT. "When we were clearing the storage lockup yesterday," Almeida said, "for the euthanasia prep, we had to collect Rex's service records, his training files, his handler documentation. It's all kept together." She put her hand on the box. This was inside a secondary container we almost missed. It was tucked behind the filing cabinet. Whoever packed up Marsh's effects after he was killed, they included this, and it never made it to next of kin. It just sat here. Nora looked at the box. There's a voice recorder inside, Almeida said. Still has charge. We tried it. She paused. I think you should hear it, Bot. The recorder was a standard military-issue digital unit, olive drab, palm-sized. It had Marsh's name written on the back in permanent marker, faded but legible. Nora held it in both hands for a moment before pressing play, not because she needed to prepare herself, but because she'd learned a long time ago that some things deserved a second of acknowledgement before you moved through them. The recording started with static, then the sound of wind, outdoor audio, somewhere with open space. Then a voice. Male, mid-30s, not performing anything, just talking. Hey, buddy, if you're hearing this, and I don't know who you is, could be a handler, could be whoever's cleaning out my locker, could be nobody. But if Rex is still around and this ends up near him, play this loud enough. He responds to my voice better than any command. You probably already know that. A pause. Wind. 6 years. We did 6 years together. I know that's not a lot to some guys, but it's a short silence, something unsteady in it. It's most of what I've got that I'm proud of. I want whoever's handling him to know he's not mean. He's never been mean. He's just specific. He's loyal in a way that doesn't transfer easy. You can't command it into him. You have to earn it. Another pause. If something happened to me, if that's why you're listening to this. The voice steadied. Rex, hey, none of this was your fault. Nothing that happens to me is ever your fault. You kept doing your job. You keep doing your job. The recording cut out. The storage room was completely quiet. Dr. Almeida was looking at the shelving unit. Nora was looking at the recorder in her hands. She'd heard soldiers talk about their dogs before. She'd heard it in the field, the particular register of it, not sentimental in the soft civilian sense, but in a harder, more specific way, the way you talk about something you've trusted with your life and know would trust you with theirs. She'd heard it enough to know that what Marsh had recorded wasn't unusual. That was the part that got her. This wasn't extraordinary devotion. This was just what it looked like, and the dog had lost it without anyone on this base understanding what that actually meant. We need Rex to hear this, Nora said. Almeida looked at her. That's not a clinical intervention. I know what it is. The research on auditory grief response in working dogs is Suri. Nora used her first name without planning to. I know what the research says. I also know what I've watched for 6 days. He needs to hear that voice. A long pause. I'll have to log it as a behavioral trial, Almeida said. And I'm noting that this falls outside established protocol. Note whatever you need to. They brought Rex into the exercise yard, a larger outdoor space with a chain-link perimeter open to the sky, at 1400 hours. He came out of the temporary holding kennel where he'd been moved after the storage lockup was cleared, and he moved the way he always moved now around Nora, cautiously, but without the wall of hostility that had been there in the first days. He stayed close to her left side without being told to. Almeida had noted that 3 days ago in her log, that proximity behavior, and she'd written 3 question marks after it. Nora set the recorder on the ground in the center of the yard and stepped back. Rex looked at the recorder. He looked at Nora. He looked at the recorder again. She pressed play. The static, the wind, and then the voice. Rex went still. He went still in a way that was different from the freeze Nora had observed when she said the word anchor the first day. That had been recognition shot through with confusion, the sound of something familiar in a context that didn't make sense. This was different. This stillness was full. It was the stillness of something that had been waiting for a very long time and had finally received an answer about what it was waiting for. His ears moved forward. His nose dropped toward the recorder. He didn't rush it. He walked toward it slowly, the way he'd approached the fence that first morning, maintaining the option to stop, to reverse. And then he reached the recorder and stood over it and listened to the rest of the recording with his head low. When the voice said none of this was your fault, Rex made a sound. It was the same sound he'd made on the first day, through the chain link. Low, not a whimper, not a growl. Something that existed in the space between those two things. something that Nora had never heard from a dog before and didn't quite have the vocabulary for. When the recording ended, he lay down next to the recorder and put his chin on his paws and didn't move. Nora sat down on the ground a few feet away. Almeida was writing in her notes. Nora couldn't see her face. They stayed like that for a long time. The dog, the recorder, the nurse sitting cross-legged in the exercise yard dirt, until Almeida finally said quietly, without looking up from her notes, "I'm going to recommend suspension of the order pending a full behavioral evaluation." She paused. "I'll need a week to write the clinical justification." "I know," Nora said. "You'll need to be available for the evaluation review." "I know. And I'm still logging this as outside protocol." "Suri." Nora looked at the dog, who had not moved. "I heard you the first time." The problem with Fort Callaway was that it was small enough that news traveled faster than decisions. By the following morning, word had spread through the base that the ER nurse from Keller Pines had somehow talked Colonel Yates into postponing the Rex euthanasia twice now, and was spending her off hours sitting in the exercise yard with the dog that had put Captain Mercer in surgery. The responses to this information fell into three distinct categories: people who found it impressive, people who found it idiotic, and people who found it irritating for reasons they couldn't quite articulate but felt strongly about. Dr. Preston Hale was in the third category. He appeared in the ER nursing station at 0800 on day 8, looking for Nora, who wasn't there because she'd come in at 0700 and was already 40 minutes into a shift that had started with a laceration and escalated to a suspected cardiac event in a 38-year-old on his morning run. Hale waited. He was patient in the specific way that people are patient when they've already decided what they're going to say and are simply waiting for the opportunity to say it. When Nora came back to the station to update the chart, he was standing at the desk. "We need to talk," he said. "I have 4 more charts." She didn't look up. "The administration received a complaint." That made her look up. "About the K9 situation." Hale crossed his arms. "Specifically about a member of clinical nursing staff conducting unauthorized behavioral interventions on a military asset, potentially creating legal exposure for the hospital." Nora set down her pen. "Who filed it?" "That's not information I have access to." "Who does have access to it?" "Hospital administration, Dr. Okafor's office." He said it with the slight emphasis of someone who has already spoken to Dr. Okafor's office. "Nora, I'm not coming at you personally here. You're a good nurse. What you've been doing with the dog, whatever your intentions are, it's creating a problem for this department. Okafor wants to see you this afternoon." "Fine." "It's not fine. They're talking about a formal review." "Then I'll speak to the review." She picked up her pen again. "You don't seem to understand. Preston." She used his first name with the specific weight of someone who doesn't use it lightly. "I understand perfectly. Someone filed a complaint, probably the same someone who told that kennel worker it was safe to go in that night, and now there's a formal mechanism in motion to get me away from that dog before the behavioral evaluation is complete." She kept her voice level. "I understand all of it. I'll be at Okafor's office at whatever time they specify." Hale stared at her. Then he walked away, and there was something in the way he walked, the slight alteration in posture, that told Nora she'd said something that landed, even if she hadn't said it to convince him. Dr. Maren Okafor was the hospital administrator, a woman in her late 50s who'd run medical facilities in 3 different states and had the diplomatic efficiency of someone who'd managed too many personnel conflicts to have strong feelings about any individual one. She heard Nora out. She asked 3 specific questions. She looked at the documentation Nora had brought: Almeida's session notes, the copy of Streck's authorization, the scheduling confirmation from Yates's office. And she took her time with it. Then she said, "The complaint is from Dr. Ferris." Nora kept her face neutral. Dr. Ferris, the veterinarian who'd been scheduled to carry out the euthanasia order twice now. Of course it was. "He's citing professional scope violations," Okafor continued. "Specifically, that you represented yourself to military personnel as having expertise in animal behavioral assessment, which is outside your clinical license." "I never represented myself as having that expertise," Nora said. "I told Major Streck I had operational experience working alongside K9 units. That's accurate. The distinction may not protect you in a formal review." "I know." A pause. "Dr. Oak, I'm not going to ask you to make this go away. I'm asking you to delay any formal action until the K9 behavioral evaluation is complete. 4 days from now, there will be an independent assessment on record. At that point, the question of whether my involvement was appropriate becomes a lot clearer. Okafor looked at her for a moment. You're very certain about that evaluation. I am. Why? Nora thought about the exercise yard, the recorder on the ground, the sound Rex had made. Because I watched something change, she said, and I know what I saw. Okafor looked back at the documents. 4 days, she said. After that, I'll need to respond to the complaint regardless of outcome. That's fair. And Nora, she paused. Whatever you did or didn't tell Major Streck about your qualifications, if there's more to your background than what's in your personnel file here, you should probably expect it to come up. Nora nodded once. I know. She walked out into the corridor, and for a moment she stood against the wall and looked at the ceiling and thought about the recorder in her jacket pocket. She'd carried it since Almeida gave it to her, an impulse she hadn't entirely explained to herself. The recording was logged in evidence, but the physical unit had been released to her temporarily for the evaluation documentation. She wasn't sure why she was carrying it. Maybe it was the same reason she'd set anchor at the fence on that first morning. Not calculated, just instinct. The knowledge that some things needed to be kept close to something warm. Her phone rang. Unknown number. Military prefix. She answered. Ms. Voss? A voice she didn't recognize. Male, formal, with the cadence of someone who spent most of his professional life delivering information concisely. My name is Warrant Officer Dale Pruitt, SOCOM Liaison Office. I'm calling at the request of someone who came across your name in connection with the Fort Calloway K9 situation. Nora was very still. We'd like to meet with you, Pruitt said. Not by phone. In person, if possible. When? Tomorrow. 800. There's a conference room in the admin building on base. Major Streck will confirm the location. What's this about? A brief pause. It's about your service record, Ms. Voss, and some questions that apparently need to be asked in person. Another pause, shorter. There are people who'd like to understand a little better who they've been dealing with. The line went quiet. Nora lowered the phone and looked at it for a moment. Then she looked down the corridor toward the exterior door, toward the direction of the exercise yard where Rex was in his temporary kennel, and thought about the 4 days she had left, and the complaint from Ferris, and the formal review hanging over her head, and the SOCOM liaison who apparently now knew her name. She thought about all of that, and then she put her phone in her pocket and went back to finish her charts, because there were still 4 of them left, and the shift didn't care about any of the rest of it. At 1900 hours, after her shift ended, Nora went to the exercise yard. Rex was in the kennel run they'd assigned him after the holding transfer. He heard her coming before she got to the gate. She could tell by the way he positioned himself, facing the entry, not with the old wound spring tension, but with the specific alertness of an animal who has started to expect something particular from a particular direction. She opened the gate and went in. She didn't have the recorder. She didn't have food. She sat down against the fence, and after a moment, Rex came and sat beside her. Not pressed against her, not demanding contact, just close. And they stayed like that while the desert light shifted from gold to orange to the particular bruised purple of high-altitude sunset. She didn't know who had called SOCOM. She didn't know if it was Streck or Yates or someone further up who'd run her name and pulled a thread. She'd spent years being careful about that thread. Not hiding, exactly, but not offering it. There was a version of her life that existed in her personnel file at Keller Pines, and it was accurate as far as it went. It just didn't go very far. Tomorrow was going to change that. She could feel it the way you feel weather sometimes, before it arrives, a shift in pressure. Rex pressed his shoulder against her knee. She put her hand on his head just for a second, and he let her. Yeah, she said quietly. Me too. She heard the gate to the outer compound open. Footsteps on the gravel, more than one person. She didn't turn around yet, just listened to the footsteps and counted them and thought, too many for a single kennel worker, too purposeful for a casual check. Ms. Voss. Not Pruitt's voice. Not Streck's. A woman's voice, low and even, with an authority so deeply embedded it didn't need to announce itself. My name is Colonel Adisa Brandt. I apologize for coming unannounced. Nora turned around. Brandt was standing at the kennel gate with 2 men in civilian clothes behind her. Not military in uniform, but military in every other way. The particular posture that never quite leaves. She was mid-50s, dark-skinned, silver at her temples, with a face that looked like it had processed a great deal and kept most of it internal. Rex did not move. He sat beside Nora's knee and looked at the visitors with ears forward, and he did not growl. "I was told to wait until tomorrow," Nora said. "Plans changed," Brant said. "Can we talk?" Nora looked at the two men, then at Brant, then at Rex, who was watching all three newcomers with a level steadiness that 6 days ago would have been impossible. "You can talk," Nora said. "I'm going to need to understand first who sent you and why it couldn't wait until morning." Brant was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your name came up in connection with an incident from 7 years ago, an operation in a province in eastern Afghanistan. A decision was made under fire that saved 11 lives and contradicted standing orders." A pause. "The official record on that incident was sealed. Recently, someone petitioned to have it reviewed. The desert had gone full dark now, the stars coming up hard and bright the way they do at altitude. That petition," Brant said, "was filed by the families of 3 soldiers who were on that operation. They've been asking for 7 years who made the call that brought their sons home." She looked at Nora steadily. "We found the answer 3 weeks ago, and then someone ran the name through current databases and found you here, working ER nursing on a base in New Mexico, trying to save a dog." Rex shifted his weight against Nora's knee. Nora didn't say anything. "The formal review of your record," Brant said, "is going to be significantly more complicated than anyone on this base currently understands." She paused. "And the complaint that Dr. Ferris filed this morning, you should know that it landed on the desk of someone who recognized your name, and they made a phone call." "To you," Nora said. "To me," Brant confirmed. The 2 men behind her hadn't moved or spoken. Rex hadn't moved either. The night was very still. "Colonel Brant," Nora said, "I've spent 7 years not having this conversation. I know. I'd like to understand why tonight is the night it has to happen." Brant looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Rex. At the dog sitting calm and steady beside a woman most of this base had dismissed as a nurse with an inexplicable fixation. And something moved across her face. Not sentimentality. Something more complicated than that. "Because," Brant said, "there are people in Washington who've been waiting 7 years for an explanation, and they just found out that the person they've been looking for has spent the last 6 days trying to save a grieving dog from being put down." She paused. "And someone decided that level of irony shouldn't be allowed to continue without intervention." Nora looked at her. Then she looked at Rex. Rex looked back at her with those steady, exhausted eyes. And she thought about Marcia's voice on the recorder. "None of this was your fault." And she thought about the 11 soldiers who'd come home from a province in eastern Afghanistan because someone had made a call under fire and then spent 7 years pretending they hadn't. And she thought about how grief and accountability had a way of finding you eventually, no matter how long or how far or how carefully you'd run. "All right," Nora said. She stood up. Rex stood with her immediately, as if he'd been waiting for the cue. "One condition," she said. Brant raised an eyebrow. "Whatever happens with my record, with the review, with all of it, the dog's evaluation goes forward, undisturbed. Whatever's about to change for me doesn't touch him." Brant held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, the kind of nod that was also a promise. Nora put her hand on Rex's head one more time, brief, not indulgent, and walked toward the kennel gate. She didn't know what she was walking into. She knew it was large and that it had been coming for years, and that the world she'd built for herself in the 14 months at Keller Pines was about to shift in ways she couldn't fully predict. She'd made peace with a version of that a long time ago. What she hadn't expected was that when it finally arrived, it would arrive here, in a desert base in New Mexico, at the kennel gate of a traumatized military shepherd who had needed exactly the same thing she had needed for 7 years. Someone who understood what it meant to wait. Someone who knew what had really happened. Someone who finally said, "This wasn't aggression, this was grief." And grief is not a reason to give up on something that still has the capacity to be whole. She stepped through the gate. The night was deep and cold and full of stars, and behind her she heard Rex's nails on the gravel as he walked to the edge of his run and stood watching her go. He didn't make a sound, but he didn't look away either. The conference room in the administrative building was the kind of room that had been designed for efficiency and achieved bleakness instead. Fluorescent lighting, a folding table, 8 chairs that didn't match, a whiteboard with something half erased on it that nobody had finished cleaning. Colonel Brandt sat at one end. The 2 men in civilian clothes sat to her left and didn't introduce themselves, which told Nora everything she needed to know about who they worked for. Streck was there, which surprised her. He was in the back corner with the expression of a man who had been informed of more than he expected and was still processing the geometry of it. Nora sat down across from Brandt and put her hands flat on the table. "Start wherever you need to start," she said. Brandt opened a folder. It was thin, 3 or 4 pages, which meant either the information was minimal or most of it existed somewhere that didn't get printed. Nora Ann Voss, born Flagstaff, Arizona, enlisted at 19, combat medic training, graduated top of her cohort, attached to 75th Ranger Regiment at 22, then a series of JSOC adjacent placements that aren't in the folder because they're not in any folder most people can access. She looked up. "You want to tell me if I'm getting anything wrong?" "You're not wrong," Nora said. "The operation in Kunar Province. April, 7 years ago." Brandt set down the folder. Standing orders were to hold position and wait for extraction. The extraction window was missed because of weather. The secondary window was 12 hours out. During those 12 hours, your unit took contact from 3 directions, and the ranking officer, Lieutenant Devin Tark, was hit in the first exchange. "He was unconscious," Nora said. "GSW to the head. Non-fatal, but he was out." "Which left you as the highest functioning member of the unit capable of making a command decision. There were 2 other soldiers with combat experience. Neither of them had a working radio." "You did." "I did." Brandt waited. "I called for an unauthorized extraction using a frequency that was supposed to be reserved for command-level personnel only," Nora said. She said it the way you say something you've said to yourself 10,000 times. Not defensive, not rehearsed, just worn smooth with repetition. "I made contact with a helicopter crew that was technically off mission. I gave them our position, and I told them we had a critical casualty and 11 personnel at risk. They came." "You violated direct standing orders in doing so." "Yes." "The helicopter crew were reprimanded." "I know." "Lieutenant Tark, when he recovered, filed a formal commendation for your actions and a simultaneous report about the order violation. The 2 documents sat in a sealed file for 7 years because nobody knew what to do with them." Brandt leaned back. 3 months ago, the families of 3 soldiers who were on that hillside hired someone to help them understand what had actually happened. Why they almost didn't get their sons back. The investigation led to your name. One of the men in civilian clothes slid a document across the table without comment. Nora looked at it without touching it. "The families want to make a statement," Brandt said. "The DoD is being asked to formally review the classification status of the operation. If the review proceeds, and it will proceed, your name comes out of the sealed file." She paused. "You knew this was coming eventually." "I thought I had more time," Nora said. "Most people do." The room was quiet for a moment. Streck had not moved from the back corner. Nora could feel him listening with the focused stillness of someone recalibrating. "The complaint from Dr. Ferris," Nora said. "Withdrawn," said one of the civilian men. His first words of the evening. He had a flat Midwestern accent and eyes that missed very little. "As of 2 hours ago, someone made a call." "And the hospital review?" "Dr. Okafor received a communication from the base legal office," Brandt said, "advising that the complaint involved a personnel matter currently under federal review and that the hospital review should be suspended pending resolution." Nora looked at the table. "So Ferris filed a complaint that ended up pulling a classified file, and now the complaint is gone, and I'm sitting in this room." "That's accurate." "Who made the call that got Ferris to withdraw?" Brandt looked at her steadily. "Someone who read the sealed file and made a judgment about proportionality." Nora didn't push it. She'd spent enough time around people who operated at that level to know that some attributions were deliberately left vague and pressing on them accomplished nothing. "What happens now?" she asked. "The review takes approximately 3 weeks," Brandt said. "During that time, you'll be asked to provide a formal statement. Your current posting continues as normal. We're not moving you, not disrupting your work here. The K-9 evaluation proceeds on schedule." A beat. After the review, the file is either reclassified at a lower level or declassified partially. Either way, the families get their answer. And me? That depends on what the review recommends. Brant folded the folder closed, which depends partly on how the next 3 weeks go and what comes to light in the formal statement. She looked at Nora with something that wasn't warmth but was close to it, the professional recognition of someone who had seen enough to know what they were looking at. For what it's worth, Ms. Voss, the 2 helicopter crew members who were reprimanded. The reprimands were quietly expunged from their records 18 months ago. Someone made that call too. Nora absorbed that. She hadn't known. She'd tried not to know things she couldn't fix. Get some sleep, Brant said, standing. We'll be in touch. She didn't sleep. Not most of it. She lay in her quarters with the lights off and the window cracked and listened to the desert wind move across the base. And she thought about Kunar Province and a hillside and a radio and a decision made in the dark with someone unconscious at her feet and 11 other people depending on whatever she decided in the next 60 seconds. She'd made the call. She'd do it again. She'd always known she'd do it again, which was partly why the 7 years of waiting had never entirely felt like waiting. It felt like knowing something was coming and not being able to do anything about the timing. She thought about Rex in his kennel. She thought about the recording. None of this was your fault. And she thought about Marsh, who had died in a different province, a different hillside, a different kind of impossible situation, and whose dog was still here, still waiting, still carrying something that needed to be set down. She got up at 04:30 and went for a run. 3 miles on the base perimeter, in the dark, without her phone. By the time the sky started showing gray at the edges, she was back, showered, and in the break room with bad coffee before anyone else from day shift had clocked in. Tanya came in at 06:10 and took one look at her and said, "You look like you slept for about 40 minutes. 30, Nora said. You okay? Working on it. Tanya poured herself coffee and sat across from her. She didn't ask more than that, which was one of the things Nora had come to appreciate about her. The Rex evaluation is today, right? The independent one. This afternoon. Streck put it on the base bulletin. The whole K9 program is apparently going to be there. Tanya wrapped both hands around her mug. I heard Ferris withdrew his complaint. You're not going to tell me why. Not today, Tanya nodded. Okay. She drank her coffee. For what it's worth, what you did with that dog. I don't know how you knew what you knew, but I watched you sit outside that kennel for 40 minutes on your first day doing nothing, and I thought you were either brilliant or completely out of your mind. A pause. Jury's still out on which one? Nora almost smiled. Yeah, me too. The independent behavioral evaluator was a civilian contractor named Dr. Waverly Boone, who had spent 20 years working with PTSD-affected working dogs for federal law enforcement and the military, and who arrived at Fort Calloway in a rental car with a battered leather bag and the confident unhurriedness of someone who had seen every variation of this situation and had stopped being surprised by any of them. He was 60, broad, with reading glasses perpetually on top of his head, and a handshake that suggested he spent more time out at 1,300 hours, looked at her for a moment and said, "You're the nurse." "Yes." "Tell me what you've observed. Not what you concluded. What you observed." She told him. She was specific. Behaviors, timelines, responses to stimuli, the exact sequence of each session. She did not editorialize. Boone listened without writing anything down, which either meant he had a very good memory or he was testing something about the way she spoke. Probably both. When she finished, he said, "And the recording. Almeida has it logged. We played it once, in the exercise yard, day 6. What was his response? She described it as precisely as she could. The stillness, the sound he'd made, the way he'd lain down beside the recorder afterward. Boone was quiet for a moment. "I've seen auditory response to handler recordings in 3 dogs over 20 years, he said. Each time it was significant. Each time people who weren't expecting it didn't know what to do with it. He put his glasses on. "Let's go see him." What followed was 3 hours that Nora would not describe to anyone who asked as anything other than careful. Boone worked methodically, without drama, with the patient specificity of someone who understood that what he was documenting would outlast the moment. He observed Rex across 4 different settings: the kennel run, the exercise yard, a corridor walk, a controlled introduction to an unfamiliar handler. He took notes throughout. Rex was not perfect. He startled badly in the corridor when a door slammed somewhere distant. In the introduction to the unfamiliar handler, a sergeant named Wes Fontaine, who had been briefed thoroughly and handled himself well, Rex refused all initial contact and spent 6 minutes at the far end of the yard before gradually, grudgingly, allowing proximity. Not approach. Proximity. But he didn't bite. He didn't lunge. He regulated. When Nora was present, he regulated faster. That was documented. It was also the part that Boone lingered on in his notes, the part he returned to twice during the observation. At 16:20, Boone sat across from Nora and Almeida in the veterinary conference room with his notepad open and said, "The diagnosis is consistent with what you outlined. Complicated grief response compounded by successive handler trauma and inadequate transitional support. It's not irreversible. It's not even unusual in dogs with this level of attachment history." He tapped his pen on the table. He's not a safe dog for a general population environment right now. He needs 6 to 8 weeks of structured grief support, controlled reintroduction to handler bonding, and a placement that accounts for his specific attachment profile. "What does that look like long-term?" Almeida asked. "Therapeutic assignment, veteran support program, PTSD recovery context, controlled clinical setting, not active duty canine work, at least not for the foreseeable future." He looked at Nora. "He's been bonding with you. That's a foundation. Not a permanent solution, but it's something to build from." Almeida was writing. Nora was looking at a point on the table. "The euthanasia order?" Almeida asked. "I'll file a formal counter-recommendation today. Given the documented behavioral shift and the clear grief etiology, I don't believe the evidence supports euthanasia as a proportionate response." Boone capped his pen. "I'd also recommend an internal review of how the program managed this dog's post-bereavement period. The deterioration wasn't inevitable. It was the result of specific decisions made after Marsh's death, and those decisions need to be examined." Nora looked up. "Dr. Boone." He met her eyes. "Who made those decisions?" Boone looked at his notes. The post-handler protocol was overseen by the K9 program's second-in-command at the time, a Major Victor Crane. He was transferred to another posting 8 months ago. A pause. The decision to attempt rapid handler reassignment rather than a structured morning protocol, that was his call. "And the night incident," Nora said. "The kennel worker who was told it was safe to go in." Boone's expression shifted slightly. "That's not in my scope to assess." "I know, but it's in someone's scope." Streck had appeared in the doorway. He'd been quiet, standing, listening, with the expression of a man who had been putting pieces together across the last 18 hours and was not pleased with the picture they were forming. "I've been looking into it," he said. He came into the room and sat down. The worker was a civilian contractor named Briggs. He said a member of the veterinary team told him verbally that the dog's status had been cleared for supervised entry. "Which member?" Almeida asked. Her voice had a very specific quality. "He said he didn't get a name, said it was someone in a gray jacket near the admin annex." Streck looked at Almeida. "The veterinary team wears gray jackets." "Half the base support staff wears gray jackets," Almeida said. "I know." Streck put his hands flat on the table. "I also know that Dr. Ferris was in the admin annex that evening. I know he withdrew a complaint within 2 hours of being told that a federal review had been opened. And I know that if someone wanted to derail a 10-day behavioral trial before it produced results, sending an unsuspecting contractor into that kennel would be an efficient way to do it." Nobody spoke for a moment. "That's a significant allegation," Boone said. "It's an observation," Streck said. "The allegation is someone else's job." Colonel Brandt came back the next morning. She didn't announce herself. She was simply there when Nora arrived at the veterinary wing at 0700, standing outside the exercise yard with coffee she'd brought from somewhere that wasn't the hospital cafeteria. She handed one to Nora without being asked, which suggested she'd done her homework. "Boone's report was filed last night," she said. "The euthanasia order is suspended pending formal review." "I know. Almeida told me." "There's something else." Brandt looked at the exercise yard, where Rex was visible at the far end of the run, watching them approach. "The internal review of the K9 program that Boone recommended. It's been fast-tracked. The Provost Marshal's office opened an inquiry this morning into the night incident." "Ferris?" "Under investigation, not formally charged yet. But the inquiry is open. She drank her coffee. Someone talked. One of the veterinary techs who was on shift that night saw Ferris near the admin annex and put it in a written statement this morning. Nora looked at Rex. He had moved to the gate end of his run and was watching her with his ears forward and his tail, not wagging, that would come later, weeks from now if it came at all, but raised slightly in the specific position that Boone had documented as a positive social signal in yesterday's report. "There's a request," Brandt said, "from the families. The 3 families who filed the petition about Kunar Province." She paused. "They'd like to meet with you, before the formal review is complete, if you're willing, unofficially." Nora was quiet. "You don't have to," Brandt said. "No." Nora looked at her coffee. "I'll meet with them. I'll arrange it." Brandt finished her coffee. "The review of your record is going faster than we anticipated. There are some senior people who want it resolved." She looked at Nora sideways. "You're making things complicated by being interesting, you know." "I've been told." "The dog." Brandt nodded toward Rex. "Boone's report recommends a therapeutic assignment. The Veterans PTSD Recovery Program at Sandoval Rehabilitation Center has been identified as a possible placement. It's a civilian facility, but they have a partnership with the base. They've been asking for a working dog for 2 years. She paused. "Boone also noted that Rex's current bonding baseline is with you. If the placement goes forward, there's a question of transition structure, meaning he'd need someone he trusts to be part of the handoff process. Meaning, if you were involved in his transition to Sandoval, as a consulting presence, not a clinical one, it would likely improve placement success significantly." Brandt glanced at her. "That's a civilian medical facility. The staff there include nurses." Nora looked at her. "I'm not making an offer," Brandt said. "I'm making an observation." "You make a lot of observations?" "It's what I'm good at." Rex had sat down at the gate end of his run. He was still watching Nora. The morning light was low and coming in from the east at a sharp angle, throwing long shadows across the exercise yard, and in that light he looked less like the wound-up broken animal she'd seen through the fence 9 days ago, and more like what Marcia's recording had described. Something specific, something loyal, something that needed to be understood on its own terms, rather than corrected into something simpler. Nora handed Brandt back the empty coffee cup. "When do the families want to meet?" "I can have it arranged by the end of the week." "Then the end of the week is fine." She opened the gate to the exercise yard and went in. Rex came to her immediately, not at a run, not dramatically, just steadily, and sat beside her left knee in the position he'd settled into over the last 4 days like it was somewhere he'd decided to be. She put her hand on his head. "Hey," she said quietly. He leaned into her hand with a small but definite pressure, and that was enough. The end of the week came faster than Nora expected, partly because the days filled themselves in ways she hadn't anticipated. Tuesday. Boone's counter-recommendation was accepted by the base legal office, and the euthanasia order was formally rescinded. Dr. Ferris did not appear for his shift. By midday, the veterinary department had a temporary replacement, and no one in Nora's vicinity mentioned Ferris's name directly, though the absence of it in conversations said enough. Wednesday. Nora gave her formal statement to the DoD review team in a conference call that lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes and felt longer. She said what had happened. She said it plainly, without self-dramatization, without hedging. She was asked 14 follow-up questions and answered 12 of them fully, and 2 of them as fully as the classification boundaries allowed. At the end, one of the reviewers, a woman whose name Nora wasn't given, said, "Thank you for your candor," and the call disconnected, and Nora sat in the empty conference room for a few minutes and breathed. Thursday. Rex had his first session with Sergeant Fontaine without Nora present. Almeida supervised. It lasted 22 minutes before Rex's stress signals became significant enough to end the session. Almeida's note read, "Significant progress relative to baseline. Continued structured exposure recommended. No adverse incidents." Nora read the note twice and felt something loosen slightly in her chest. Friday. The families arrived. They came in a rental SUV, 2 couples and a woman alone, the 3 sets of parents of 3 soldiers who had been on a hillside in Kunar Province 7 years ago. They met Nora in a small conference room that Brandt had arranged in the administrative building, and Brandt was not in the room with them. She had made that choice deliberately, and Nora understood why. The woman who came alone was named Patricia Wills. Her son had been 24 on that hillside. He was 31 now, working construction in Ohio, and he'd apparently told his mother 7 years ago that someone had made a call that brought them home and that he didn't know who it was and couldn't talk about it. And Patricia Wills had spent 7 years not being able to fully explain to herself why her son sometimes stopped mid-conversation and got a look on his face like he was somewhere very far away. She sat across from Nora and looked at her for a long moment, and then she said, "He told me you argued with someone, on the radio, to get them to come." "Yes," Nora said. "He said you weren't supposed to have that radio." "No, I wasn't." Patricia Wills nodded slowly. "He said you sounded like you weren't scared at all." Nora looked at the table. "I was scared. I just couldn't afford to sound it." "He didn't know your name. None of them did. The guys he served with, they called you the medic. Just the medic." She paused. "He said he's thought about you a lot. About what kind of person does that?" Nora didn't answer immediately. She thought about what kind of person does that. She'd thought about it too. "The kind of person who couldn't think of another option," she said finally. The other two couples asked different questions. One of them was practical. What had she seen? What had she assessed? How had she made the decision to call for extraction? She answered those thoroughly, in the careful language of someone who'd been over the sequence many times. The other couple was quieter. Their son had been the most severely injured of the 11, a leg wound that had required surgery and months of rehabilitation, and they sat holding hands across the table and mostly listened. Before they left, the father said, "We just needed to know somebody made a choice, that it wasn't just luck." "It wasn't luck," Nora said. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. After they left, Nora sat in this empty conference room for 10 minutes. She was not crying. She was just sitting with the particular weight of 7 years of something that had finally been given a place to land. Then her phone rang. It was Almeida. "You need to come to the exercise yard," Almeida said. Her voice had something in it that Nora had not heard before. "What happened?" "Nothing bad." A pause. "Just come." She heard it before she saw it. From 50 yards away, crossing the base courtyard toward the exercise yard, she heard the sound of applause. Not the polite clipboard and evaluation kind. The genuine, startled kind where people forget they're in a professional context for a second and just respond to what's in front of them. She came through the outer gate and stopped. Rex was in the center of the exercise yard. Beside him was Sergeant Fontaine, who was crouched low on one knee with his hand extended, and Rex was not bowing to him, not submitting, nothing that dramatic. But he was sitting close, and he was taking food from Fontaine's hand, and every few seconds he was glancing back at a particular spot along the fence line where Nora had apparently stood often enough that the spot itself had become an anchor point. When he saw her come through the gate, his ears moved forward, his tail lifted. He looked from Fontaine to Nora and back to Fontaine. Then he stood and walked 3 paces toward Nora and stopped, and looked back at Fontaine, and then looked at Nora again. "He's checking," Almeida said beside her. She'd appeared at Nora's elbow. "He's checking whether it's okay. Tell me what happened." "Fontaine came in for a scheduled session. I wasn't even here yet. He came in early, said he wanted to try it without pressure. And apparently Rex just walked up to him, not cautiously, just walked up." Almeida's voice was careful in the way of someone trying not to editorialize too much. Fontaine sat on the ground. Rex sat next to him. They stayed like that for 17 minutes. She paused. And then one of the base officers came by and saw and apparently got on his radio, and now there are 14 people standing outside this fence watching a dog sit next to a sergeant. Nora looked at the 14 people standing outside the fence. A mix of K-9 program staff, a few hospital workers she recognized, 2 people in suits she didn't. Streck was there. He was watching Rex with an expression Nora had not seen on his face before, something that was working its way through several emotional registers simultaneously. Rex was still looking at her, waiting, in that way he had, not anxious waiting, not desperate waiting, just the patient acknowledgement that there was a question open and he was giving her time to weigh in. She looked at Fontaine, who looked back at her with the slightly stunned expression of someone who had just experienced something they didn't have language for yet. "Go ahead," she said quietly. Not to Rex. To both of them, she supposed. Fontaine held out his hand again. Rex turned and walked back to him, unhurried, and sat down. The people at the fence were very quiet. Then Streck started clapping, a single, slow clap, and it was such an unexpected thing from him that the sound of it briefly silenced everything else. Tanya, who had apparently materialized from somewhere behind Nora, said something under her breath that was neither polite nor quiet. Two of the K9 program staff exchanged a look. The two people in suits were writing things down. But Nora wasn't watching any of them. She was watching Rex settle his weight against Fontaine's knee, the same position he'd settled into against hers, the same unhurried, deliberate press of contact. And she was thinking about a voice on a recorder saying, "You keep doing your job." And she was thinking about how much was contained in the act of finally being able to. She was still thinking about that when Almeida touched her arm. "There's someone here," Almeida said. Her voice had gone quieter. "One of the two in suits. He's been waiting to talk to you since before the session started." She paused. "He said his name is Colonel Hartwick. He's from the Pentagon." Nora looked at the man in the suit. He was watching her steadily from outside the fence, and in his hand was a document in an envelope with a seal she recognized immediately, and the look on his face was not that of someone who had come to observe a dog's behavioral evaluation. "He said it's about Kunar Province," Almeida said. Nora kept her face still. Around her the applause had started again. Real this time, more of it. Someone outside the fence saying something that made people laugh, and then someone else joining in. And Rex sat in the center of the yard with Fontaine's hand on his back, and the morning light hit the dust and the chain link and the worn exercise yard ground in a way that made all of it look, for one brief moment, like something that would be worth remembering. She turned away from Rex and walked toward the fence. Hartwick put the envelope through the chain link and said, "Nora Voss, there are people in Washington who have been waiting a long time to say some things to you directly." She took the envelope. She didn't open it, not yet. She looked at the seal, at her name typed in the address block in official government font, and she thought about Patricia Wills saying he didn't know your name and the father who just needed to know somebody made a choice, and the helicopter crew whose reprimands had been quietly erased 18 months ago by someone who made a call. "When?" she asked. "Monday," Hartwick said. "We'd like you in D.C." She looked back at the exercise yard. Rex had turned his head toward her. Of course he had. He missed nothing, this dog. Nothing that mattered. "I'll be there," Nora said. She put the envelope in her jacket pocket, beside the recorder she was still carrying. And Monday was 3 days away, which meant she had 3 days left, and she intended to use every hour of them. Because the thing she hadn't told Brandt or Hartwick or any of the people who'd been building a file on her for 3 weeks was the thing she'd pulled from her own memory at 0430 on the morning she hadn't slept, running the base perimeter in the dark. The name Major Victor Crane, who had made the decisions that broke Rex, who had been transferred 8 months ago, who was not yet part of any open inquiry, and whose transfer paperwork Nora had quietly looked up the morning after Boone's session and found routed not to another base but to a consulting position with a private defense contractor that had 3 active contracts with the military's K9 acquisition program, which meant Crane was not gone, which meant Crane was still, in some capacity, involved in decisions about military working dogs. And Nora had a name, a transfer date, a contractor affiliation, and 3 days before she had to be on a plane. She walked back toward the veterinary building with the envelope in her pocket and the particular focus of someone who has just identified the next problem and is already thinking about what it requires. The veterinary building was quiet at that hour, the kind of quiet that only existed in the 20 minutes between one set of activity ending and another beginning. Nora walked through it without stopping, past the examination rooms and the supply corridor and the small office where Almeida kept her files, and she went directly to the records room in the back, where she'd sat with the recorder 9 days ago, and she pulled up everything she could access on Victor Crane. She had 3 days. She intended to use them correctly. The transfer paperwork was in the base administrative database, accessible to medical staff for cross-referencing purposes, not classified at any level that would have prevented her from finding it. Crane had transferred out of Fort Callaway 8 months ago, routed to a consulting role with Meridian K9 Solutions, a private contractor based in Arlington, Virginia. Meridian held 3 active DoD contracts, one for K9 acquisition and placement, one for handler training program evaluation, and this was the one that made Nora stop and read it twice, for post-deployment behavioral assessment of military working dogs, which meant that Victor Crane, the man who had made the decisions that broke Rex after Marsh died, was now consulting on the program that decided what happened to dogs like Rex across the entire military canine system. She printed the contract summary. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket with Hartwick's envelope and the recorder, and then she went and found Streck. I was in his office, which was unusual for 1600 hours on a Friday. He was at his desk with a stack of papers in front of him, and the expression of a man who had found something he hadn't been looking for. "Crane," Nora said, without sitting down. Streck looked up. He didn't seem surprised that she'd come to him with this. Maybe he'd already found his own thread and was pulling it from the other end. "Sit down," he said. She sat. "Meridian Canine Solutions," he said, confirming it before she could. "You already know." "I found out an hour ago. Someone in the Provost Marshal's office ran his name as part of the Ferris inquiry, and the Meridian connection came up." He pushed the stack of papers toward her slightly. "The post-deployment behavioral assessment contract. It was Crane who wrote the evaluation criteria. He submitted them to DoD 8 months ago, shortly after he arrived at Meridian. The criteria were approved and implemented across 15 bases." Nora looked at the papers. "What do the criteria say?" "They establish a 3-strike protocol for working dogs who injure handlers post-deployment." Streck's voice was level, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. "Third incident triggers an automatic euthanasia review. The review period is 30 days. He paused. Rex had 4 incidents. Under Crane's protocol, the euthanasia order wasn't just a local decision by Yates. It was being processed as a protocol-compliant action under criteria that Crane himself wrote. Nora was quiet for a moment. "The protocol doesn't include any provision for grief response assessment," she said. "No. It doesn't require a behavioral evaluation before the euthanasia review is initiated. No. It doesn't ask why the incidents happened, just how many." Streck looked at her. "No." She put the contract summary on his desk. 15 bases, she said. "How many dogs are currently in euthanasia review under this protocol?" He picked up the papers and found a page near the back. "As of the last quarterly report, 11. Nora looked at the wall. 11 dogs. 11 animals who had possibly lost their handlers, possibly been grief responding to loss the way Rex had, possibly being processed toward death under a protocol designed by the man whose failure of care had created this situation in the first place." "Hartwick," she said. "Pentagon, yes. He's here because of my record review, but Meridian needs to be part of what he's told." She stood up. "Streck, the families who came on Friday, one of the things they said was that they needed to know somebody made a choice, that it didn't just happen." She looked at him. "This is happening. 11 dogs. Someone needs to make a choice." Streck picked up his phone. Well, the call to Hartwick lasted 40 minutes. Nora was present for the first 20, during which she laid out the Meridian connection, the protocol authorship, the 15 base implementation, and the 11 current euthanasia reviews, in the same precise clinical language she used when presenting a patient case. Hartwick listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said 3 words: "Send me everything." And then he and Streck continued on a line that Nora stepped out of, because the next 20 minutes were going to involve clearance levels above her current access, and she knew when to leave a room. She went back to the exercise yard. Rex was in for the evening, back in his assigned kennel run after the afternoon session. The base had quieted down the way it did as weekends started. A different energy than weekdays, less structured, the background activity dropping to a lower register. She sat outside his run on the equipment crate, and he came to the fence and stood close, not pushing against it, just present. 11, she said quietly. Not to him. Just out loud, because sometimes saying a number made it real in a different way than thinking it. Rex made a small sound, not the grieving sound from before. Something shorter, more alert. She looked at him and thought, not for the first time, about how much of communication was just being willing to stay in the same space long enough for something true to pass between two beings. She stayed until the sun went down. Then she went inside and wrote a 12-page document detailing everything she knew about the Crane-Meridian connection, the protocol's structural failures, and the behavioral alternative she'd observed with Rex. She sent it to Streck, Almeida, and Hartwick's contact email at 2130 hours. Then she went to bed and slept for 6 hours, which was better than 30 minutes and worse than she needed, but it was what she had. Saturday came in fast and complicated. Almeida called at 0740. Ferris made a statement. Nora was already on her second cup of coffee. To the inquiry? Yes, last night. A pause. He admitted to being near the admin annex the evening of the kennel incident. He admitted speaking to a contractor. Another pause. Longer. He said he didn't tell the contractor to go in. He said he told the contractor that the dog had been calmer lately, and the contractor made his own interpretation. That's a very specific way of not admitting something, Nora said. Yes. His attorney was clearly present for the drafting. Almeida's tone was dry. But the statement also includes something useful. He said he'd been in contact with someone outside the base who had an operational interest in the outcome of Rex's evaluation. He didn't name the person, but the inquiry has subpoena authority. Crane, Nora said. That's the provost marshal's read. Is there communication? Email? Calls? That's what the inquiry is looking for. Almeida paused. Nora, this is moving fast, faster than I expected. Does that concern you? It concerns me that fast movement creates the opportunity for things to be done sloppily. A beat. I want the outcome to be right, not just quick. Nora thought about that. I know, but 11 dogs don't have the time it takes to do this carefully. Silence on the line. No, Almeida said. They don't. Hartwick's team pulled Crane's communication records on Sunday morning. Nora wasn't told this directly. She found out because Streck came to the exercise yard at 900 looking like someone who had been on the phone since before dawn and needed a minute of air that wasn't a conference room. He stood outside the fence and watched Rex, who was doing a slow circuit of his run with the kind of loose-limbed unhurriedness that Almeida had documented as a positive behavioral indicator. Then Streck said, 14 emails between Ferris and a Meridian Canine Solutions address registered to Crane, starting 6 days before you went to Streck's office the first time. Nora did the math, before I even approached the kennel. The first email was sent the morning Crane's protocol review was submitted to DoD for the annual assessment. The review was going to cite Rex as a case study in successful protocol application. He looked at her. If Rex's euthanasia had proceeded on schedule, Crane's protocol would have had a completed case file to point to. An animal that had met the 3-strike threshold, followed the review process, and been euthanized according to criteria. And if Rex recovered instead, Nora said, then the case file shows a dog who should have been assessed for grief response from the start, wasn't, deteriorated under the protocol's framework, and nearly died because the protocol had no provision for behavioral etiology. He paused. Which is exactly what it shows now. Rex had stopped at the near end of his run and was looking at Streck with the particular focused attention he applied to anyone who entered Nora's immediate vicinity. Not hostile, evaluating. Crane was trying to protect the protocol, Nora said. Crane was trying to protect the contract. Meridian's annual canine assessment revenue is tied to DoD's confidence in the protocol. Streck finally looked away from Rex. If the protocol is shown to be structurally flawed, the contract goes to review, potentially cancellation. How much is the contract worth? Annual value, approximately $4.2 million. She looked at the ground. $4.2 million. And 11 dogs in euthanasia review, and 1 dead almost on paper shepherd who is currently pacing a kennel run in New Mexico, looking like he might, eventually, be willing to trust the world again. Streck, she said. He looked at her. What happens to the 11 dogs under review at the other bases? If the Crane-Meridian connection becomes official, if the protocol is flagged as compromised, the reviews would need to be suspended pending a new assessment framework. How long does that take to process through the system? He was quiet for a moment. Without intervention, months. With intervention? He met her eyes. Hartwick is Pentagon. If he decides this is a priority, it can be faster. Then make sure he understands it's a priority. She looked at Rex. Not because of me. Not because of what's in that envelope from Washington. Because of 11 animals who are running out of time under a protocol that was written to serve a contract instead of them. Streck nodded once. He took out his phone and walked away from the fence, already dialing. Oh. Sunday afternoon, Nora packed a bag for Washington. It took her 11 minutes because she didn't own much that was suitable, and she wasn't going to pretend she did. She packed what she had, added the folder with Hartwick's envelope and her formal statement documents, and set the bag by the door of her quarters. Then she went back to the exercise yard for what she knew might be one of the last sessions before things changed significantly. Boone had said the Sandoval placement could begin processing within 2 weeks of the evaluation filing. 2 weeks wasn't very long. She was in the yard with Rex when Tanya appeared at the outer gate, slightly out of breath, with the expression she got when she'd walked faster than she'd intended. "There are reporters," Tanya said. Nora looked up. "Where?" "Outside the base main gate, 2 vans. Someone apparently leaked the Ferris investigation, and now there's a story running on an Albuquerque news station about a military dog that was almost euthanized and the conspiracy behind it." She caught her breath. "The base communications office is losing its mind." Nora looked back at Rex, who had turned to face the gate at Tanya's arrival and was watching her with calm interest. "What does Yates want?" "He wants everyone involved to say nothing. Official statement is pending." "That's standard." "He also—" Tanya hesitated. "He also apparently said something to the communications officer about how this wouldn't have become a media situation if certain people had stayed in their lane." Nora absorbed that without expression. "He said it about you," Tanya clarified, unnecessarily. "I know who he said it about." Tanya looked at Rex. "Is he doing okay? The dog?" "Better every day." "The news station is calling him a hero dog." Tanya's voice was caught between professional neutrality and something warmer. "They got his name somehow. They're calling him Rex the Warrior." Rex's ear twitched at his name, just the one ear. Nora watched it. "He's not a warrior right now," she said. "He's just a dog trying to figure out how to be okay again." "Maybe that's the same thing," Tanya said. Nora didn't answer that. She put her hand on Rex's back and he leaned into it slightly, the small, deliberate pressure she'd come to recognize as his version of acknowledgement. And she thought about Monday in Washington and the envelope in her bag and the 11 dogs and the 3 hours of sleep she'd had the night before. And she thought about how strange it was that the thing that had started with a stranger stopping outside a kennel had unfurled into this: a news story, a Pentagon review, a criminal inquiry, a canceled euthanasia order, and a dog who was learning, slowly, how to be in the world without the person he'd organized his world around. She stayed until the last of the light was gone. Monday arrived the way Mondays do, indifferent to everything that had happened before them, asking only that you show up. Nora was at the veterinary wing at Yo 600 before the flight, which left at 10:30 from the regional airport 40 minutes east. She'd arranged with Almeida for Rex's sessions to continue in her absence. Fontaine was committed to daily contact, and Almeida had brought in a behavioral technician from Boone's network to provide continuity. It was a good plan. Nora had checked it 3 times and it was good, and she still felt the particular friction of leaving something unfinished that hadn't yet become finished. Rex was at the gate of his run when she arrived. He'd started doing that, positioning himself toward wherever she usually came from, in the mornings. Almeida had documented it twice in her notes as anticipatory social behavior, which was a clinical way of saying he knew she was coming before she got there. She went in. She sat on the ground and he sat beside her, and she didn't say much because there wasn't much that needed saying. She had the recorder in her jacket pocket. She'd decided, sometime in the small hours of Sunday night, to leave it with Almeida for the Sandoval transition. It needed to stay close to Rex, not travel to Washington with her. She'd carry the voice in her own memory. That was enough. She put it on the ground between them. Rex looked at it. He didn't react the way he'd reacted the first time. No stillness, no grieving sound. He just looked at it with the recognition of something he'd processed and placed, the way you look at an object that used to mean everything and now means something different, something that still matters but doesn't hurt the same way. "You're going to be okay," she said. He looked at her. "I know you've heard that before from someone who didn't come back." She looked at the recorder. I'm coming back. But even if something happened and I didn't, you're going to be okay. That's not a promise. It's just what's true." She paused. "Fontaine's good. Almeida's going to be there, and Sandoval, the place they're talking about. There are people there who are going to need exactly what you know how to do. Soldiers who've been through things you understand better than most." She looked at him. That's not nothing. That's the opposite of nothing. Rex put his chin on her knee. She let him stay there for a minute. Then she stood up, and he stood with her, and she walked to the gate, and he followed her to the edge of his run and stopped. The boundary he understood now, the line he didn't need a fence to observe, and watched her go. She picked up the recorder from where she'd left it on the ground and handed it back through the chain link to Almeida, who had appeared at some point without Nora noticing. "Keep that close to him," Nora said. "I know." Almeida took it carefully. "Call me when you land." "I'll be back Thursday." "I know that too." The flight to Washington connected through Dallas and landed at Reagan National at 1748 local time, and by 1900 Nora was in a hotel room 9 blocks from the Pentagon that the DoD review team had arranged, sitting on the edge of the bed with her folder in her lap and Hartwick's envelope still sealed in front of her. She'd carried it for 4 days without opening it. She opened it now. Inside was a single document, official DoD letterhead, dense with formal language that she read through twice in the way she'd learned to read official documents, looking first for what it said and second for what it was careful not to say. It was a formal notification of the record reclassification review, which was the expected part. What she hadn't expected was the second page, which was a separate document on different letterhead, older paper, slightly off-white, with a date stamp from 7 years ago. It was a commendation. Lieutenant Devin Tark's commendation, the one he'd filed after Kunar Province, the one that had sat in a sealed file alongside the order violation report for 7 years. She'd known it existed. She hadn't read it. She read it now. It was 6 paragraphs. The last one read, "The action taken by the attached combat medic demonstrated exceptional judgment, composure under direct fire, and disregard for personal consequence in service of her unit's survival. In my assessment, this action was not a violation of orders, but an exercise of the kind of battlefield judgment that orders cannot anticipate and training cannot fully prepare for. It is my strong recommendation that this record be revisited at a later date by personnel with the appropriate context to assess it fairly." 7 years. In a sealed file. Someone finding it now and including it in this envelope, in this hotel room, on this particular night. She folded the document and put it back. Then she took out her phone and found a number she hadn't dialed in 3 years. It rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered, cautious in the way of someone who hadn't been expecting this call from this number. "Nora." "Hey, Tark." She looked at the wall. "I read it. The commendation." A pause on his end, something shifting. "They told you they were sending it." "They sent it without telling me. I just opened it." Another pause. "I wrote it the day after we got out. Sent it before I left the field hospital. I didn't know what they'd do with it. They sealed it. I found out later. I tried to get it unsealed twice." His voice was flat in the way of someone who'd run into institutional walls often enough to know the exact texture of them. "Twice they told me it was under review. Then I stopped trying because it wasn't going anywhere, and I didn't want to make things harder for you." "You didn't make things harder." "Nora." A breath. "You saved 11 people. You broke a rule and it cost you, and nobody was ever allowed to say so officially, and I've thought about that a lot." "I know." "Are they fixing it now?" "Working on it." She looked at the envelope on the bed. "Tuesday's meeting is going to be... I don't know yet what it's going to be. Whatever it is." He paused. "You deserve to have your name on what you did." She didn't answer that immediately. Outside the hotel window, Washington was doing what Washington did at night. Lit up and moving and entirely indifferent to the individual currents running through it. "How's the leg?" she asked. "Good days and bad days." A pause. "Mostly good now. I run again. Not fast, but running." She heard something in his voice that was approximately a smile. "I thought about you when I did the first one. The first run after the surgeries." A beat. "I thought, this is because someone made a call." She put her hand flat on the bed beside the envelope and looked at it. "Get some sleep," Tark said. "Tuesday's going to be long." "Yeah." She looked at the ceiling. "Hey, Tark." "Yeah." "The dog," she said. "You would have liked this dog." A pause. "Tell me about him." She did. She talked for 20 minutes, which was longer than she'd talked about anything and longer than she could clearly remember. And when she hung up, she felt something that wasn't quite peace but was in that direction. something that had been braced for 7 years slowly, carefully, beginning to do something other than brace. Tuesday's meeting was in a DoD conference suite on the 4th floor of a building 3 blocks from the Pentagon. It was not the Pentagon itself, which Nora took as a calibrated signal, significant enough to require a dedicated space, not significant enough to pull into the main building. The DoD review lead was a 2-star general named Vivian Osei Kuffour, who had the specific kind of authority that doesn't feel the need to announce itself and the specific kind of attention that makes everything you say feel examined from multiple angles simultaneously. There were 7 people in the room. Nora knew Hartwick. She didn't know the others except by type: legal, administrative, records. One woman in the corner who wrote nothing down and watched everything, which meant she was either psychological assessment or senior intelligence, and either way, Nora made sure to say exactly what she meant. Osei Kuffour opened by saying, "We've read the full file. We have questions, but they're mostly for clarification, not dispute. The record is going to be reclassified downward. That's already decided." She looked at Nora. "What we want to understand from you directly is what you want the outcome to look like." Nora had not expected to be asked that. She took a moment. "The helicopter crew," she said. "Their reprimands were expunged. I found that out recently. I want to know that's complete and documented, not just administratively erased." "It's documented," Hartwick said from across the table. "I want the families to have access to the full account, not a summary. The actual sequence of what happened, in language that tells them clearly that their sons were brought home because of a specific human decision, not luck or circumstance." Osei Kuffour nodded. "And Crane," Nora said. The room shifted slightly. "The Meridian Protocol," she said. "The 11 dogs in review across 15 bases. That's connected to what brought me here in the sense that it's the same pattern. Institutional process overriding clinical reality, because the process serves something other than the thing it claims to serve." She looked at Osei Kuffour. "I'm not saying my record and the K9 protocol are the same thing. I'm saying the inquiry into Crane's conduct needs to include the protocol, not just the communication with Ferris. Because Ferris is a symptom. The protocol is the actual problem." Silence. "We're aware of the protocol situation," one of the legal people said carefully. "Then I want to know that the 11 reviews are suspended while the protocol is evaluated, not eventually, before the quarterly assessment that's due in 3 weeks. Another silence, longer. Osei Kuffour looked at the legal person. Something passed between them. Then she looked back at Nora. "That's a significant ask." "I know." "You're not in a position where you're negotiating," the legal person said. "I know that too." Nora looked at him steadily. "I'm in a position where I can tell you that the record you're reclassifying belongs to someone who made a call when the institutional process couldn't account for what was actually happening on the ground. I'm asking you to make the same call now for 11 animals who are running out of time under a protocol that was built to serve a contract." She paused. "That's not a negotiation. It's a request from someone who's been in the business of keeping things alive when the system wasn't sure they were worth keeping." The room was quiet for a long moment. Then Osei Kuffour looked at Hartwick and said, "Get me the list of the 11 cases by end of day." Wednesday was deposition style. 3 hours of formal documentation, her formal statement read into record, clarifications provided, a legal review that went over every factual claim in the 12-page document she'd sent to Hartwick before leaving Fort Calloway. It was exhausting in the specific way that careful, precise verbal work is exhausting. The concentration required to say exactly what you mean, no more, in language that will survive being read by people who are looking for imprecision. By 1600, she was back in the hotel room with a headache and a distinct desire to be somewhere that wasn't a conference room. She called Almeida. "He let Fontaine put a leash on him today," Almeida said. "Briefly, maybe 30 seconds. But he let him." Nora sat on the edge of the bed and let that settle in. "He also," Almeida's voice went slightly careful, "he also started approaching Fontaine on his own this morning, before Fontaine came all the way into the yard. Met him at the gate." "That's significant." "I know. I wrote 3 sentences about it in my notes, and then deleted 2 of them because I didn't want to editorialize." "What did the one sentence you kept say?" A pause. "It said, 'Subject appears to be choosing contact rather than tolerating it.'" Nora looked at the ceiling. "That's the right sentence." "I thought so. A beat. How's Washington? Large, slow in the wrong places, and fast in the wrong places. That tracks. Almeida paused. Nora, what you put in that document about Crane and the protocol and the 11 dogs, it's circulating. I've had 2 calls today from veterinary staff at other bases asking if I can speak to our case. The Provost Marshal's inquiry has apparently been expanded. Good. Crane's attorney filed something this morning, a preemptive statement, claiming that the protocol was developed in good faith and that any adverse outcomes were the result of local implementation failures rather than design flaws. Of course he did. The Provost Marshal's response was to request all of Meridian's internal communications related to the protocol design. Almeida's voice had a quality that Nora had come to recognize as satisfaction being kept at a professional distance. All of them. That's not a small request. No, Nora said, it's not. She hung up and sat in the hotel room and thought about design flaws and good faith and the specific art of constructing a justification that sounds systemic when it's actually personal. She'd seen it enough times, in field reports, in incident reviews, in the particular language that institutions use when they're protecting themselves instead of examining themselves. Crane had built a protocol that would have killed Rex. He'd done it to protect a contract, and he'd tried to make sure the protocol got to do its job by making sure the behavioral trial didn't succeed. That was the shape of it. Clear, documented, provable. What wasn't yet clear was whether the expanded Provost Marshal inquiry would find what it needed in Meridian's internal communications. What wasn't yet clear was whether the protocol review would move fast enough to matter for the 11 dogs currently sitting in 30-day review windows. What wasn't yet clear was how the formal reclassification of her record would land, what it would mean practically, what the next version of her life looked like. She was thinking about all of that when her phone rang. A Fort Calloway number. Not Almeida, not Streck. A number she didn't recognize. She answered. Miss Voss? A voice she didn't know. Male, younger, slightly uncertain in the way of someone who had decided to make a call and was now in the first 10 seconds of it. My name is Sergeant Fontaine. I'm sorry to call. Dr. Almeida gave me your number. Fontaine, she said. Is something wrong? No? A pause. No, nothing's wrong. He stopped. Started again. Rex fell asleep in the yard this afternoon. After the session, just lay down in the sun and fell asleep. Another pause. He did it right next to where you usually sit, like he was... He stopped again. I don't know why I'm calling. I just thought someone should know. Nora looked at the wall. Outside the hotel window, Washington continued being Washington, large and lit and indifferent. Thank you for calling, she said. Is that a good sign? The sleeping? Yes, she said. That's a very good sign. She heard Fontaine exhale. Okay. A beat. Okay, good. I'll let you get back to Fontaine. Yeah. You're doing well with him. What I'm hearing from Almeida, you're doing it right. A silence. I'm trying to figure out what he needs. That's the whole job, Nora said. She hung up and sat with that for a moment. Then she reached for the folder with her documents and pulled out the page she hadn't looked at since Sunday night. Tark's commendation, the last paragraph, the kind of battlefield judgment that orders cannot anticipate and training cannot fully prepare for. She'd spent 7 years thinking that what she'd done in Kunar province was a rupture, a moment where she'd stepped outside the structure and the structure had never fully let her back in. She'd carried that as a kind of permanent low-grade tension, the knowledge of the steps she'd taken and what it had cost. What she was only now beginning to understand. Sitting in a Washington hotel room with a dog falling asleep in the New Mexico sun in her usual spot, and 11 animals in euthanasia, review, and an inquiry. Running on a man who'd tried to make the system do his dirty work was that the rupture and the capacity were the same thing. The thing that had made her step outside the process in Kunar province was the same thing that had made her stop at a kennel fence and say a word she shouldn't have known. It was the same thing that had made her sit in Osei Kufour's conference room and ask for 11 animals she'd never met. She folded the commendation back into the folder. Thursday morning, she would fly back to Fort Calloway. She would go directly to the exercise yard. She would sit in her usual spot, and Rex would find her there, and they would continue the slow, imperfect, necessary work of what came next. But before any of that, she had one more thing to do. She opened her laptop. She pulled up the Meridian K9 Solutions website, which was professionally designed and said nothing specific, and then she pulled up the DoD contract database, and she cross-referenced the Meridian contract numbers against the three other companies who had bid on the same work 8 years ago when the contract was originally awarded. She was looking for something specific, something she'd noticed in Tuesday's deposition when the legal person had said good faith, and she'd filed the phrase away for later examination. It took her 40 minutes to find it. The original contract bidding process, the evaluation panel, the names of the 4 DoD evaluators who had scored the competing bids. 3 of them were standard military appointments. She recognized the roles. The 4th was a civilian consultant whose name she hadn't seen before, a retired K9 program administrator named Marcus Crane, Victor Crane's father, who had scored the original bid evaluation that gave Meridian their first DoD contract. 6 years before Victor Crane joined Meridian as a consultant, 6 years before the protocol that bore his son's fingerprints was written and submitted and approved. She sat back in her chair. She looked at the screen. Then she closed the laptop, opened her phone, and called Hartwick. He answered on the second ring. "I need to tell you something," she said, "and I need you to tell me whether the Provost Marshal's inquiry has the scope to follow where this goes." A pause. "What did you find?" She told him. The silence on his end lasted 4 seconds, which for Hartwick was a very long silence. "Send me the documentation," he said finally. "Send it now, tonight, before you go to sleep." "I'll send it in the next 20 minutes. Nora." He said her name the way people say names when they're recalibrating the size of something. "This isn't just the protocol anymore." "No," she said, "it isn't. This is procurement fraud. Potentially. If the evaluator connection holds up." "I know what it is." Another pause. "Are you sure you want to be the one who sends this?" She thought about Rex asleep in the sun in her usual spot. She thought about 11 dogs in 30-day review windows. She thought about a voice on a recorder saying, "You keep doing your job," and a man who had built a system to fail the very animals it claimed to protect, and a father who had scored a bid that made his son's career, and the particular way institutional corruption operated, not in dramatic villainous choices, but in small accommodations accumulated over years until the system was shaped entirely around protecting itself. "Yes," she said, "I'm sure." She hung up and opened her laptop and started writing. She sent the documentation at 11:47 p.m. and then sat in the dark for a while doing nothing, which was not the same as having nothing to do. It was more like the pause after a long exhale, the body understanding before the mind does that something significant has been released. She slept better that night than she had in 2 weeks. Thursday arrived gray and cold, which was unusual for that part of the country in that season, and the flight back to Fort Calloway was delayed 40 minutes by weather at Dallas. Nora sat in the terminal with bad coffee and her phone and read the 3 messages from Hartwick that had come in overnight. The first was acknowledgement of the documentation. The second said the procurement records had been flagged for cross-agency review. The third, sent at 6:14 a.m., said only, "Marcus Crane's evaluation scores are under audit. Do not discuss with anyone at the base until further notice." She didn't reply to any of them. She drank the coffee and watched planes sit on the tarmac in the rain and thought about the particular patience required to have done something right and then wait for the world to catch up to it. The flight landed at 13:40. She was at the exercise yard by 14:30. Rex heard her before she came through the outer gate. She could see him repositioning at the far end of his run, ears forward, body angled toward the entrance with the anticipatory focus that Almeida kept documenting and that Nora kept finding herself moved by in a way she wouldn't have admitted to in professional company. When she came through the gate, he didn't rush toward her. He walked, purposeful and steady, the way he did everything now, and stopped 2 feet away and looked at her face with those eyes that had learned to trust the specific geometry of her presence. She crouched down to his level. "Hey," she said. He put his nose against her cheek. Brief, definite, and then he stepped back and sat down, which was so completely him that she almost laughed. "Good to see you too," she said. Almeida appeared from the veterinary wing looking like someone who had been managing 8 things simultaneously for 3 days and was doing it competently, but would like it acknowledged. "Welcome back. Fontaine's been here every day. Session notes are on your desk. I mean, on the table in the yard because you don't have a desk out here, but I put them somewhere you'd find them. How is he?" Fontaine or Rex? Both. Rex is... Honestly, Nora, the progress this week is significant. He initiated contact twice with Fontaine without any prompting. He took the leash 3 times. Yesterday, he held a heel command for 40 meters before he got distracted by a bird and completely lost interest, which is maybe the most normal dog behavior I've documented in 2 months, and I wrote it down with a lot of enthusiasm. She paused. Fontaine is good. He's careful and consistent, and he doesn't push. He's right for this dog. And Sandoval? The placement coordinator called yesterday. They're ready to proceed when the behavioral evaluation clearance comes through. They have a program director, a Dr. Riva Solis, who's been working with combat veterans for 12 years. She reviewed Boone's report and said, Almeida checked her phone, quote, "This is exactly the kind of dog we've been waiting for," end quote. Nora looked at Rex, who had settled into a sit beside her and was watching the middle distance with the mild philosophical attention of an animal at rest. 2 weeks? She asked. If everything processes on schedule. Make sure Boone's final report is filed by end of week. Already in his inbox. The Crane story broke on a Friday, 8 days after Nora sent Hartwick the documentation on Marcus Crane's bid evaluation. She didn't find out from the news. She found out from Streck, who knocked on the doorframe of the ER nursing station at 10:15 and said, Department of Defense Inspector General just issued a public statement. Meridian K9 Solutions contract under fraud investigation. Victor Crane named as a subject. Marcus Crane named as a subject. Nora looked up from her chart. Public statement. Front page of the DoD press briefing, which means it'll be every news outlet by noon. He crossed his arms. The Provost Marshal's inquiry into the Fort Calloway incidents has been absorbed into the IG investigation, which means Ferris is now a federal witness, not a local case. And the 11 dogs? All reviews suspended as of Wednesday, apparently. Hartwick's office pushed it through. Streck looked at her with the expression of someone who had recalibrated a great many things over the past 3 weeks. The suspension notice went to all 15 bases, simultaneously. Nora set her pen down. They're also withdrawing the protocol from implementation, Streck said. All canine behavioral assessment criteria are being sent back to review. New framework to be developed by an independent panel. He paused. Boone's been asked to consult. Good, Nora said. He asked if you would co-consult, specifically asked, said he wanted someone with field experience on the panel. She looked at him. I'm an ER nurse. You're also... He stopped. The reclassification came through this morning. Hartwick sent me a copy. He reached into his jacket and put a folded document on the nursing station desk. I'm not supposed to have that, but someone sent it to me anyway. She looked at the document. She didn't pick it up yet. Your record, Streck said, has been formally reclassified and amended. The commendation TARC filed is now part of your official record. The order violation notation has been removed, on the grounds that the order itself failed to account for the operational reality on the ground. He looked at her steadily. And there's a formal recommendation attached from Osei Kufur's office that your contributions be recognized at the appropriate level. What does that mean practically? It means there's going to be a ceremony. He said it in the tone of someone who understood she would not be enthusiastic about this. Not optional, they were pretty clear about that. She picked up the document. She read it twice. The language was official and careful and said in institutional terms what TARC had said in 6 paragraphs 7 years ago, that what she'd done had been the right thing, that the right thing had been treated as a wrong thing, and that the record now showed what had actually happened. It was not a small thing. She'd spent 7 years telling herself it wouldn't be a big thing when it finally arrived, and she'd been wrong about that, and she was willing to be wrong about it. She folded the document and put it in her pocket. Streck, she said. He looked at her. Thank you. For the calls you made. The ones that got me the time I needed. He was quiet for a moment. I made a couple of calls, he said. You did the rest. He picked up his radio, which had been buzzing insistently. And you have a shift to finish. She picked up her pen and went back to the chart. The IG investigation moved faster than federal investigations usually moved, which Nora suspected had something to do with Osei Kufur and whatever she'd said to whoever needed to hear it. Within 2 weeks of the public statement, the following had been formally reported, documented, and in several cases made very public. Victor Crane had authored the three-strike K9 protocol with full knowledge that it lacked the behavioral assessment provisions recommended by independent veterinary experts, provisions he had personally reviewed and rejected during the drafting process. Internal Meridian communications, subpoenaed in full, showed him describing the behavioral assessment requirement as operationally burdensome and likely to extend review timelines in ways that affect contract deliverables. The deliverables in question were quarterly performance reports that measured protocol efficiency partly by euthanasia completion rates. That last detail, euthanasia completion rates as a performance metric, was the one that got picked up by every news outlet that covered the story, and not without reason, because it was the detail that made the shape of the thing unmistakable. Marcus Crane's bid evaluation scores for the original Meridian contract had been found, on audit, to be statistically inconsistent with the evaluation criteria applied to the other three bidders. 2 of the 4 evaluation panel members had since died. One was unreachable. The 4th gave a statement to the IG that contained the phrase, "I had concerns at the time that I didn't feel I had standing to raise," which was the kind of sentence that lands in an investigation like a stone in still water, sending ripples in all directions. Meridian K9 Solutions lost its DoD contracts within 3 weeks of the IG statement. The company's other federal contracts, 2 with law enforcement agencies, were placed under review. Victor Crane did not appear publicly at any point during this period. His attorney issued a statement saying his client disputed the characterization of events and looked forward to presenting the full context in the appropriate forum. The appropriate forum, when it eventually convened, did not find the full context to be exculpatory. Ferris was removed from the Fort Calloway veterinary program. He was not criminally charged. His involvement had been limited to the communications with Crane and the incident with the kennel worker, neither of which cleared the threshold for federal prosecution. But his professional license was referred to the state veterinary board, and whatever happened next with that was between him and the board. He did not return to Keller Pines. Dr. Preston Hale, for his part, did nothing legally actionable and said nothing publicly and stayed entirely in his lane for the remainder of the period, which was itself a kind of answer to a question nobody had formally asked. The 11 dogs in suspended euthanasia review were assessed individually by the independent panel that Boone was convening. 7 were cleared for rehabilitative placement within 6 weeks. 3 required extended behavioral evaluation. 1, a Belgian Malinois at a base in North Carolina, was determined after thorough assessment to have a genuine aggression profile unrelated to grief response, and that case was handled separately, carefully, and with the kind of clinical rigor that the old protocol had never demanded. The outcome in that case was not euthanasia. It was a permanent civilian placement with a specialist handler. Not every story ends with the dog in the exercise yard looking like a different animal, but every story deserves to be properly examined before anyone decides how it ends. Rex's placement at Sandoval Rehabilitation Center was confirmed on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after Nora came back from Washington, and the transition began the following Monday. Nora drove. She and Fontaine took Rex in a base vehicle, a 2-hour drive north through high desert country that turned greener as they gained elevation, and Rex rode in the back with his head resting on the edge of the seat divider and his eyes tracking the landscape in a way that looked like interest rather than anxiety. Fontaine drove. He and Nora didn't talk much, which was fine. They'd reached the kind of working understanding that didn't require filling silences. Sandoval sat at the edge of a small town in the foothills, a low-built complex of adobe-style buildings surrounded by cottonwoods and a long fenced yard that backed up to open land. It was not grand. It was functional and clean, and there were wind chimes on the main entrance porch that Nora had not expected and didn't dislike. Dr. Riva Solis met them in the parking lot. She was 50-something, compact and weathered in the way of people who spent a lot of time outdoors, with reading glasses on a cord around her neck, and the specific kind of directness that Nora associated with people who had spent years working in spaces where pretense was not productive. She looked at Rex before she looked at either Nora or Fontaine. "Hey," she said to the dog. Rex looked at her. He didn't approach. He stood beside Nora's left knee and assessed. "That's fair," Solis said. She looked at Nora. "You're Voss." "Yes." "I read your documentation, all of it, including Boone's notes and Almeida's session logs." She looked back at Rex. "What he needs most right now isn't a protocol. It's time and consistency." I know, Nora said. Fontaine's been consistent. He'll be here 3 days a week for the first month, if your schedule allows. We'll make it allow. Solus crouched down, not approaching Rex, just getting to his level. He watched her from 3 feet away with his ears slightly forward. I've got 4 veterans currently in residential program who specifically requested an animal component. 2 of them have dog backgrounds. 1 former MP, 1 who worked with search and rescue before he was deployed. She looked up at Nora. They're going to meet him on his terms. No pressure, no performance expectations. They just exist in the same space until something happens, or it doesn't. That's the right approach, Nora said. I know it is. Solus stood. I've been doing this 12 years. I know how to wait. Rex had moved, barely, just a small shift of weight forward, towards Solus. He stopped himself and held the position, not retreating, not advancing, somewhere in the middle. That's enough for today, Solus said, and she meant it as a complete sentence, not a disappointment. It was enough. It was, in fact, more than enough. They stayed for 2 hours. The handoff was gradual. Nora and Fontaine walking the perimeter of the facility yard with Rex, then Solus joining, then Nora hanging back while Fontaine and Solus continued, then Fontaine hanging back too, until Rex was making his own survey of the space with the 2 women watching from a distance. He kept looking back at Nora. She stayed still and let him look and didn't move toward him, because part of what she'd understood over the past weeks was that reassurance, poorly timed, could become a crutch. He needed to learn to carry some of his own weight now. Not all of it. Nobody carries all of it alone. But some. The part that was his. When they finally left, Rex was inside, and he watched them go from a window in the main receiving room. Nora looked back once. His ears were forward. He was not distressed. He was watchful in the specific way of an animal that has decided to pay attention to what comes next, rather than to what is already past. That was enough. In the car heading back south, Fontaine drove for 20 minutes before he said, "You think he's going to be okay there?" "Yes," Nora said. "You're sure?" She thought about it honestly, because Fontaine deserved an honest answer more than a reassuring one. "I think he's going to have hard days. I think there are going to be mornings where he looks for something that isn't there anymore, and that doesn't just stop because the environment is right." She looked at the road. "But I think he's learned something important in the last few weeks." "What's that?" "That the fact that someone's gone doesn't mean there's nobody left." She paused. "That's not a small thing to learn. That's actually most of it." Fontaine was quiet for a while. Then, "He taught me something too." "Yeah?" "That the thing that looks like aggression isn't always aggression." He kept his eyes on the road. "I've been thinking about that a lot. Applied to other things. Not just dogs." Nora looked at him sideways. "You're going to be fine with him," she said. "Keep showing up on your days. He'll do the rest." The ceremony was on a Saturday, 6 weeks after Washington, and it was exactly as formal and uncomfortable as Nora had expected, and also something she hadn't expected. It was attended by people she hadn't thought to anticipate. The families were there. Patricia Wills. The 2 couples. They sat in the 3rd row of a conference hall at Fort Calloway with the particular quiet dignity of people who have waited a long time for something and are now watching it arrive. Tark had come from wherever he was stationed now, whilst he walked with a slight irregularity in his gait that he probably no longer noticed, and he sat next to Patricia Wills, which was a coincidence of seating that turned out not to be a coincidence at all, because someone in the logistics office had read the file and made a thoughtful decision. Streck was there in full-dress uniform, which made him look exactly the same but with more buttons. Almeida was there in civilian clothes, which was when Nora discovered that Almeida owned a blazer in a deep green color that suited her and that she had clearly not worn in some time because she kept pulling at the collar. Tanya was in the back row with 2 other nurses from Keller Pines, and she was already crying before anything official had started, which she would later blame on allergies, and nobody would challenge this claim to her face. Osi Kufour was there in person, which Nora had not been told to expect, and which told her something about what the general had decided this day represented. The citation was read. It was specific, not vague governmental language about valor and service, but specific. The hillside, the radio, the 11 soldiers, the decision. It named Tark. It named the helicopter crew. It put on public record in a room full of people. The sequence of what had actually happened and who had made what call and why. Nora stood at the front and listened to her own record being read aloud and felt the strange doubled sensation of recognizing herself in the language and also of hearing it for the first time. Because there's a difference between knowing what you did and hearing someone describe it as a thing that mattered. When Ose Kuffer pinned the commendation to her jacket, she leaned in and said, quietly enough that it wasn't for the room, "You should have had this 7 years ago." "I had other things to do," Nora said. Ose Kuffour looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once, the kind of nod that contained an entire paragraph, and stepped back. The applause started. It was not the startled, spontaneous kind. It was the kind where people have been holding something that needed releasing and are finally allowed to release it. Nora stood in it and looked out at the room and found, despite every reasonable personal preference to the contrary, that she couldn't make herself look away from it. Not today. In the front row, Patricia Wills was not crying. She was sitting very straight, and she was looking at Nora with an expression that was not complicated at all. It was the expression of someone who has been carrying an unanswered question for 7 years, and has finally had it answered. Nora looked back at her. She didn't smile or wave or do any of the things that the moment might conventionally have called for. She just held the look, and Patricia held it back. And between them passed something that didn't have a ceremony and didn't need one. What? 3 things happened in the weeks after the ceremony, not in dramatic sequence, but in the ordinary way that consequential things tend to happen, quietly, specifically, while other things are also happening. The first, Victor Crane was formally charged by the DoD Inspector General's office with procurement fraud and contract manipulation. The charges were specific and extensive. His attorney's statement about full context stopped appearing in press briefings. Marcus Crane was referred to the relevant federal oversight body for the bid evaluation misconduct. Neither man had a public comment. The silence was its own kind of statement. The second, Boone's independent K-9 behavioral assessment panel issued its preliminary framework, a 23-page document that replaced the 3-strike protocol with a tiered evaluation system requiring behavioral etiology assessment before any euthanasia review could proceed. The document cited the Rex case twice by name as a primary example of what a grief-responsive approach looked like in practice. It cited Nora's session documentation as a contributing source. Boone called her when it was published and said simply, "Your name's in the references. I thought you should know before you read it somewhere else." She hadn't expected that. She sat in the break room at Keller Pines with her cold coffee and her phone and thought about what it meant for her name to be in a document that would change how the military system handled grieving animals, and she found that she couldn't think of a better place for it. The third, Hartwick called on a Thursday morning with a question framed as an observation, which was his consistent method. "The behavioral assessment panel is going to need a field consultant with medical and operational background," he said. "Someone who can review individual case files and provide a ground-level read on whether the clinical evaluations are capturing the full picture. It's a part-time advisory role. Compatible with another posting." "Compatible with an ER nursing position?" she asked. "Hypothetically, yes." "At Fort Calloway, hypothetically?" "Keller Pines has expressed interest in retaining their ER staff," Hartwick said, with the exact tone of someone delivering information they have verified in advance. She looked at the break room wall. There was a crack in the plaster near the window that had been there since she arrived 14 months ago, and that maintenance kept saying they'd fix and never did. She'd become so accustomed to it that she'd stopped seeing it, and now that she was looking directly at it, it struck her as oddly specific. The kind of imperfection that you only notice when you're trying to figure out whether a place feels like home. "I'll take the advisory role," she said. "I assumed you would," Hartwick said. "You could have just offered it." "You don't respond well to being told what you want," he said, "so I made sure you arrived at it yourself." She thought about arguing with that and decided it was accurate enough to let stand. "Send me the paperwork," she said, and hung up. The first time Nora visited Sandoval after the transition, it was a Wednesday, 5 weeks in, and she hadn't announced she was coming. She drove up alone, early, and Solis met her at the main entrance with 2 cups of coffee and the expression of someone who had been expecting this visit without knowing quite when it would arrive. "He's in the yard," Solis said. They walked around the main building to the side yard where the cottonwoods were, and Nora stopped at the corner of the building and looked. Rex was in the yard with 3 men. One of them, the former MP, Nora recognized him from Solis's description, was sitting on a bench with his elbows on his knees and his head low, the posture of someone in the middle of a hard hour. Rex was beside him, pressed against his leg, not doing anything, just there. Just the specific weight and warmth of being present without asking for anything back. The other two men were talking quietly at the far end of the yard. One of them kept glancing over at Rex and the man on the bench. He caught Nora's eye from across the yard, a stranger's face, and she didn't know his story. What he'd been through, what had brought him here, what he was watching Rex do with the kind of attention that looked like recognition. She would probably never know the specifics. She knew the shape of it. The man on the bench put his hand on Rex's back. Rex didn't shift. He stayed exactly where he was, solid, unhurried, doing the thing he was built to do, which was not aggression and had never been aggression. It was this: presence. The willingness to stay in the same place with someone who needed another body in the room. The ability to hold still while someone else works through whatever they're working through. He went to him on his own, Solis said quietly. First day. We hadn't even started the formal introduction sequence. He just walked across the yard and sat down next to Kellum. She nodded toward the man on the bench, and stayed there for an hour. Kellum hadn't said a word to anyone in 3 days. What did Kellum say after? He asked Solis if the dog could sleep in his room. Solis smiled slightly. He can't, but he asked. Nora watched Rex for another minute. He was not looking at her. He was entirely focused on the man beside him, which was exactly right. She was not the most important thing in his life anymore, and that was not a loss. It was the whole point, the entire purpose of every hour she'd sat in the dirt of the exercise yard. She drank her coffee. She watched the cottonwoods move in the wind. She thought about what it costs to be misunderstood for long enough that you start to lose your own shape, to be labeled dangerous when you're really just broken, to be processed instead of seen, to have your grief called a character flaw and your loyalty called a liability. She thought about how that cost doesn't disappear when the misunderstanding is corrected. It just becomes something you carry differently, something that changes the way you move through the world. Not the direction, maybe, but the way you hold your weight. Rex turned his head, briefly, and looked at her. 1 second, maybe 2. Then he turned back to Kellum, and the man who hadn't spoken in 3 days put his other hand over the first and pressed them both into the dog's fur, and Rex closed his eyes slightly. Not all the way, just the half-close of an animal that has decided, for this moment, that the situation does not require full vigilance. And the yard was quiet, and the cottonwoods moved, and everything was, in the specific imperfect way that things are, exactly what it needed to be. Nora drove back south with the windows down and the high desert air moving through the car, cool at this altitude even in the afternoon. She wasn't thinking about Washington or the IG investigation or the procurement fraud charges or the ceremony or any of the institutional machinery that had been set in motion over the past 2 months. She was thinking about a word: anchor. She'd said it at a fence on a morning when she hadn't entirely known what she intended to do. She'd said it because she recognized something, and the recognition had preceded the plan, the way real things usually do. Not the plan first, then the feeling. The feeling first, the thing you know before you know why you know it, and then everything else arranged itself around that. She'd spent 7 years trying to be smaller than the thing she actually was. Not because she was ashamed of it, but because the thing she was had cost her, and she'd made a quiet, private calculation that minimizing the surface area was a form of protection. Don't be notable. Don't be the thing they need to explain. Be the nurse in the ER at a base in New Mexico. Let the classified files stay classified. But the thing about being specific, the thing she'd understood watching Rex work through his own version of the same calculation, was that you couldn't actually choose between your real size and your safe size indefinitely. Eventually, the situation finds the part of you that knows what to do, and it asks, and you either answer or you don't. She'd answered. She wasn't sure she'd always be glad she had. There were going to be days when the weight of the advisory role and the visibility of the commendation and the simple fact of being known were harder than the weight of being invisible. She didn't expect otherwise. She wasn't built for simple outcomes, and she'd made her peace with that a long time ago. The peace you make, not because it's comfortable, but because it's true, and true things are the only solid ground. The road curved south through the foothills, and the desert opened back up below, vast and pale and indifferent to everything that had happened in it, which was its own form of honesty. The land didn't care about Crane or Ferris or sealed files or public ceremonies. It was just there, doing what it did. She thought about what Tanya had said that first morning. Maybe that's the same thing, talking about a dog who was just trying to figure out how to be okay again, and whether that was the same as being a warrior. She'd been inclined at the time to say no. She was inclined now to say it was more complicated than either answer. Because the truth about warriors, the actual truth, not the ceremonial version, was that most of the work happened in the quiet spaces. In the decision to stay when it would be easier to leave. In the willingness to sit in the dirt outside a chain-link fence for 40 minutes doing nothing, waiting for an animal who has been hurt by too many people to take one step in your direction. In the ability to be present for something that is not yet resolved and may not resolve in the way you want, and to stay present anyway. That was the work. Not the citation, not the pinned commendation, the 40 minutes in the dirt. The word said quietly at the fence. The recorder left on the ground in the middle of an exercise yard, playing a dead man's voice into the silence. The highway straightened out. Fort Calloway appeared on the horizon, the base structures small and geometric against the mountains. Nora kept both hands on the wheel and drove toward it, toward the ER shift that started at 0700 tomorrow, toward the advisory case files that would arrive next week from bases across the country, toward whatever came next, which she didn't know yet, which was fine, which was in fact the only honest relationship you could have with the future. The things she'd learned, not in Washington, not in the ceremony, not even in the exercise yard with a recorder playing in the dust, was something she'd actually known for a long time, and had simply been too careful to let herself say directly. You don't get to choose whether people underestimate you, but you do get to choose what you do while they're doing it. And the choice, made over and over in the small moments before anyone is watching, is the thing that determines everything else. Not the recognition when it comes. Not the ceremony. The choice in the dark, alone, when the window said 7:42 and the dog had 3 hours and 18 minutes and someone had to run. She had run. She would do it again. She drove into the low desert sun with the windows still down, and the air smelled like salt and stone and distance. And somewhere north in the foothills, a dog with a dead man's voice in his memory was pressed against the leg of someone who needed exactly what he knew how to give, and neither of them required an audience for it to matter. That was enough. That had always been enough.